beneath the vast skies of the ancient world, where deserts breathed heat, and mountains guarded forgotten valleys, a new kind of power began to rise. Long before Europe imagined empires, before Rome carved its roads, the lands of Persia stirred with something older, something enduring. Here, on the edge of the Iranian plateau, tribes became nations, kings became legends, and a civilization began to shape the destiny of continents. The Persian Empire was not merely a conquest of territory. It was an experiment in governance, in tolerance, in ambition vast enough to unite languages, religions, and peoples under one imperial horizon. From the first fires of Zoroastrian belief to the thunder of cavalry across Mesopotamia, Persia's story is one of resilience and transformation. It is the story of Cyrus the Great, who conquered with mercy, of Xerxes, who challenged Greece itself, of palaces that glittered like stone dreams, and of empires that fell not in silence, but in flames. To follow Persia is to follow the heartbeat of ancient history, where the shadow of empire still stretches into our modern world. Chapter 1. The Land Before Kings. In the dawn of an age long before emperors carved their names into stone, the land that would one day be called Persia was not yet an empire. It was not yet a center of power. It was a vast, difficult world of distance and silence, of mountains that rose like walls against the sky, of deserts that stretched endlessly beneath burning suns, and of valleys where life clung to rivers like a fragile promise. The Iranian plateau was not a gentle homeland. It was harsh, elevated, and unforgiving, shaped by cold winters, dry winds, and the constant challenge of survival. Yet it was precisely this landscape that forged the people who lived upon it. Here, strength was not a choice. Resilience was not an ideal. It was necessity. In these early centuries, there was no unified Persia. Instead, there were scattered tribes and small communities, pastoral peoples moving with their herds, farmers cultivating narrow strips of fertile soil, clans bound together by kinship, loyalty, and the rhythms of the land. Their world was local, personal, and deeply rooted in tradition. To the west, beyond the Zagros Mountains, older civilizations already flourished. Mesopotamia, land of the Tigris and Euphrates, was a world of cities, temples, writing, and kings. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria. Names that echoed across the ancient world like thunder. To the southwest, Elam stood as an ancient kingdom, centered in the region of Susiana, with its own culture and power long before Persia rose. And so, the peoples of the plateau lived in the shadow of giants. They watched empires rise and fall beyond their mountains, learning from them, trading with them, sometimes fighting them, yet remaining distinct, shaped by a geography that protected and isolated them at once. It was during the second millennium BCE that slow movements began to reshape this world. Indo-Iranian peoples, part of wider migrations across Eurasia, gradually entered the Iranian plateau. These were not armies of conquest in the modern sense, but long migrations of tribes seeking pasture, land, and survival. Over generations, they blended with local populations, forming new identities. Among them emerged groups that would later become central to history, the Medes in the northwest and the Persians farther south. At this stage, they were not rulers of empires. They were tribes among many, living between stronger neighbors, learning the realities of power. Assyria, in particular, would loom large, its armies feared across the Near East, its kings demanding tribute from distant peoples. The early Persians were shaped by this pressure. The world taught them that survival required unity, that scattered tribes could not endure forever against organized empires, and so even in these quiet beginnings, the seeds of transformation were being planted. Yet Persia's origins were not only political, they were spiritual. Across the plateau, ancient beliefs took root beneath the open skies. Fire, light, and the forces of nature held sacred meaning. The struggle between order and chaos, truth and deception, became central themes in Iranian thought. These early foundations would later find their most enduring expression in Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest known monotheistic faith traditions. Though the prophet Zoroaster's exact dates remain debated among scholars, the spiritual world that produced him belonged to this deep early era, an age when morality was not merely social, but cosmic. In the Iranian worldview, life was a choice between Asha, truth, order, righteousness, and Druj, lie, chaos, destruction. This was not mythology for entertainment. It was a philosophy of existence, a moral structure that would later shape Persian kingship itself. Because in Persia, the king would not rule only by strength. He would rule by divine responsibility, to uphold order against chaos, to protect the world from collapse. And so, long before Cyrus the Great, long before Persepolis glittered in stone, Persia was already forming in silence, in the migrations of tribes, in the endurance of harsh geography, in the slow growth of identity, and in the spiritual imagination of a people who believed the universe itself was a battlefield of truth. This was the land before kings, the quiet beginning before greatness, the fragile seed buried deep in the soil of history, waiting patiently for the moment it would break. Beneath the shadow of empires, the Iranian plateau remained a world of transition, never fully isolated, never fully absorbed. It was a frontier between civilizations. To the west, the river kingdoms of Mesopotamia; to the north, the steppes of Central Asia; to the east, distant lands stretching toward the Indus. Persia's homeland sat at the crossroads of worlds, and history rarely allows such crossroads to remain quiet forever. By the early first millennium BCE, the peoples of the plateau were no longer invisible to their neighbors. The Medes, settled in the northwest, began to organize into stronger confederations. The Persians, farther south in the region of Pars, lived under the presence of Elamite influence and the looming reach of Assyria. Assyria, at its height, was a machine of war and administration. Its kings ruled from Nineveh with ruthless precision, projecting power across the Near East. They demanded tribute, crushed rebellions, and recorded their victories in stone reliefs where enemies knelt in submission. For the tribes of Iran, Assyria was both threat and teacher. It demonstrated what organized power looked like. It showed that empire was not merely conquest, but structure, roads, taxation, bureaucracy, discipline. And slowly, the Iranian peoples began to change. The Medes emerged first. By the 7th century BCE, they had grown strong enough to challenge Assyria itself. Under leaders like Cyaxares, the Medes transformed from scattered groups into a kingdom capable of coordinated warfare. In alliance with Babylon, they struck at the heart of Assyrian power. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. It was one of the great turning points of the ancient world, the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, long thought unstoppable. The Near East entered a new balance of power, and the Medes stood among its inheritors. Yet even then, Persia was not yet the center. The Persians remained for a time subordinate, vassals under Median authority. Their kings ruled locally, learning, waiting, adapting. They were not conquerors yet. They were apprentices of empire. It is here, in this quiet tension, that Persia's true transformation began. Because the Persians were not merely surviving. They were absorbing lessons from every direction: Elamite culture, Mesopotamian administration, Median political structures, Indo-Iranian traditions. Their identity was forming as a synthesis, rooted in the plateau, yet shaped by the wider ancient world. And in their southern homeland, new lines of leadership emerged. Among them was the Achaemenid clan, a royal house whose name would soon become inseparable from world history. At first, they were minor kings of a small territory. Their ambitions were not yet written across continents. But the conditions of history were aligning. The Iranian plateau had always demanded resilience. Now it demanded unity. Across these lands, social bonds were tightening. Tribal loyalties began to shift toward larger political structures. Warfare, diplomacy, and trade pulled scattered peoples into closer contact. The idea of kingship itself was evolving, from local chieftains to rulers who claimed broader authority. And above it all remained the spiritual horizon, the Iranian sense of cosmic struggle between truth and chaos gave kingship a deeper meaning. Rule was not only political, it was moral. A king was expected to uphold order, protect the community, and stand against forces of destruction. This belief would later become one of Persia's defining legacies, the idea that empire could be justified not only by conquest, but by responsibility. As the 6th century BCE approached, the Median Empire stood as the dominant Iranian power. But dominance is rarely permanent. Beneath the surface, new forces were gathering. The Persians, once quiet in the south, were preparing for their moment. The stage was set for the rise of a figure who would change the ancient world forever. Cyrus, son of Persia, heir to the Achaemenids, destined to overturn the old order. But before Cyrus could conquer Babylon, before Persia could become an empire of continents, it first had to emerge from this long prehistory, the land before kings, the centuries of endurance, the slow forging of identity beneath Chuz mountains and harsh skies. History, after all, does not begin with triumph. It begins with waiting. And Persia had been waiting for centuries. In the silence before empire, the Iranian plateau held its breath. For generations, Persia had existed as a name without grandeur, tribes without unity, kings without global reach, a people shaped more by landscape than by conquest. Yet history is never still. Beneath the surface of quiet centuries, the forces of transformation were always moving, like tectonic plates beneath the earth. By the mid-6th century BCE, the old balance of power in the Near East was beginning to shift once again. Assyria was gone. Babylon ruled the fertile rivers. Lydia controlled wealth in Anatolia. Egypt remained ancient and proud along the Nile. And in the highlands of Iran, the Medes held dominion over the plateau. But dominion is not destiny. The Median Empire, though powerful, was not built on unshakable foundations. It was a coalition of tribes and territories held together by loyalty that could fracture under pressure. And within its southern lands, the Persians were no longer merely subjects. They had grown stronger. They had learned. They had endured. Among them rose Cyrus, a figure standing at the threshold between the forgotten past and the imperial future. In later centuries, Greek historians would surround his story with legend, but the historical truth remains clear. Cyrus was a Persian king who united his people and challenged the Median order. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus rebelled against the Median king Astyages. It was not simply a revolt. It was a turning point in world history. The Persians defeated the Medes, and Cyrus inherited their empire. With one victory, the scattered tribes of Pars stepped into the mantle of power. The Iranian plateau, long divided, was now unified under Persian leadership. And suddenly, Persia was no longer peripheral. It was central. The land before kings had become the land of a king unlike any before it. Yet the significance of this moment was not only political, it was civilizational. Cyrus's rise marked the culmination of everything that had come before: the migrations, the harsh geography, the centuries of cultural exchange, the spiritual foundations of Iranian thought. Persia's empire would not emerge from nothing. It emerged from endurance. From the mountains that hardened its people, from the deserts that taught them survival, from the shadow of Mesopotamian empires that taught them governance, from the moral imagination that framed rule as responsibility. This was the inheritance Cyrus carried into history, and it would shape the empire he built. For Persia was about to expand beyond the plateau, beyond tribal memory, into the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, the cities of Anatolia, the gates of Egypt, the edges of India. But before that expansion, there was this quiet truth. Every empire begins as a fragile seed. Persia's seed had been planted in the deep past, watered by hardship, shaped by faith, and strengthened by centuries of waiting. The world often remembers empires only at their height, when palaces shine, armies march, and kings command continents. But the true story begins earlier. It begins with scattered tribes beneath harsh skies, with traditions whispered beside fires, with identity forming slowly, patiently, across generations. It begins in the land before kings. And now, with Cyrus rising, the dawn was breaking. The plateau was no longer a forgotten frontier. It was becoming the heart of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Thus ended the quiet beginning. And thus began the Age of Persia. A new chapter was about to open, one written not only in conquest, but in vision. Because Cyrus would not simply build an empire of power. He would build an empire of mercy. And in the next chapter, Persia steps out from the mountains and into history's center, as Cyrus the Great begins his world-changing rise. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Achaemenids. In the dawn of the 6th century BCE, the world was still ruled by ancient powers whose names carried weight like stone. Babylon stood beside its rivers, crowned with temples and walls. Egypt endured along the Nile, timeless and proud. Lydia glittered with wealth in Anatolia. And across the Near East, kingdoms rose and fell beneath the long memory of Assyria's vanished terror. Yet beyond the western cities, beyond the fertile plains where empires had always gathered, there was another land, higher, harsher, quieter. The Iranian plateau. For centuries, Persia had been a frontier people, shaped by mountains and deserts, living in the shadow of stronger neighbors. Its tribes had endured, learned, waited. They were not yet rulers of history. They were still becoming. But history rarely announces its turning points with sudden noise. Sometimes it begins with a name emerging from obscurity, a dynasty, a line of kings whose ambitions stretch farther than their homeland. In the southern region of Iran, in a place known as Anshan, once tied to the older civilization of Elam, a Persian royal house was gathering strength. They were not yet emperors, they were local kings, ruling a small domain at the edge of larger powers. But they belonged to a lineage that would soon reshape the world. The Achaemenids. Their origins were modest, almost fragile when compared to the great kingdoms around them. The Persians themselves were still a people divided into clans, bound by kinship and tribal loyalty. Their political structures were young, their reach limited. Yet within this fragmentation lay possibility. Because Persia was changing. The collapse of Assyria had shattered the old imperial order, leaving space for new powers to rise. The Medes had filled that space first, uniting much of the plateau under their authority. For a time, Persia existed under Median dominance, subordinate, watching, learning. But beneath that surface, Persian identity was consolidating. Tribal bonds were tightening. Leadership was becoming clearer. And the Achaemenid house, ruling in the south, was positioning itself for something greater than survival. In this era, kingship was not merely command, it was symbolism. A king was the protector of the people, the upholder of order, the one who stood between community and chaos. Persian thought, shaped by ancient Iranian spirituality, carried a deep sense that rule was moral as well as political. To lead was to carry responsibility before the divine. And so the Achaemenids did not rise only through force. They rose through legitimacy, through the slow gathering of loyalty, through alliances built across clans, through the understanding that Persia could no longer remain scattered if it wished to endure in a world of empires. Anshan, though small, became a seedbed of transformation. Here, Persian kings learned the arts of governance from older traditions. Elamite administration, Mesopotamian models of power, Median structures of authority. Persia was absorbing the world around it, preparing itself quietly, patiently, for its own moment. And then, in the middle of the century, that moment arrived. A figure emerged from the Achaemenid line who would change everything. Cyrus. Born into a world still dominated by the Medes, Cyrus inherited not an empire, but a possibility. Persia was still peripheral, yet Cyrus carried within him the accumulated weight of centuries, the resilience of the plateau, the ambition of a rising dynasty, the hunger of a people ready to step beyond their limits. The Medes, under King Astyages, held power over Iran. But their empire was not unbreakable. Coalitions fracture, loyalty shifts, the world was restless. And Cyrus understood what history was offering. In 550 BCE, Cyrus rose against Astyages. It was not merely rebellion. It was the birth of Persia as a unified force. When the Medes fell, Cyrus did not destroy their legacy. He inherited it. The Persian and Median peoples were drawn together under one rule. The plateau, long divided, was united at last. And in that union, the Achaemenid dynasty stepped into history's center. Persia was no longer a minor kingdom of the south. It was becoming an imperial power. The rise of the Achaemenids was not sudden conquest alone. It was the culmination of slow preparation, of tribes becoming a nation, of leadership transforming identity into destiny. The world beyond Iran had not yet realized what was beginning. But the foundations were laid. A new empire was waking. And Cyrus was only at the start of his journey. Beneath the widening sky of the ancient Near East, the fall of the Medes marked more than a change of rulers. It marked a change of rhythm in history itself. For generations, Persia had been a land of waiting, tribes shaped by endurance, kingdoms confined to the margins of larger powers. But with Cyrus's victory over Astyages, that long silence ended. The Persians were no longer subjects beneath another crown. They were becoming the crown. And what emerged was not merely a new kingdom, but a new imperial idea. The Achaemenid dynasty, now at the helm of a united Iranian plateau, faced a world still dominated by older powers: Lydia in the west, Babylon in the heart of Mesopotamia, Egypt beyond the deserts. Each was ancient, wealthy, and proud. Each carried centuries of civilization behind its walls. But Cyrus carried something different. He carried momentum, the strength of a people newly unified, the legitimacy of inheritance, not destruction, and the vision of expansion not as chaos, but as order. The early Achaemenid state was still forming its shape. Persia did not yet possess the vast bureaucracies of Babylon or the monumental traditions of Egypt. But it possessed something equally powerful: adaptability. Cyrus understood that an empire could not be built through conquest alone. The Iranian tribes that now followed him were warriors, yes, but they were also communities bound by loyalty. They needed purpose beyond raiding and battle. So Cyrus began to transform Persia from a tribal confederation into a structured power. The Medes, once enemies, were not erased. Their elites were integrated. Their military traditions were absorbed. Their administrative knowledge became Persian strength. In this, Cyrus demonstrated a rare instinct. Empire was not built by wiping the past away, but by gathering it into something larger. Thus, Persia's rise was not merely violent. It was strategic. And the first great test lay to the west. Lydia, ruled by King Croesus, was one of the richest kingdoms of the age. Its gold flowed from the rivers of Anatolia. Its influence stretched across Greek cities, and its armies were seasoned. Croesus saw Persia's rise as a threat, and perhaps an opportunity. He moved first, but history favored Cyrus. Around 547 BCE, Cyrus marched westward. The clash between Persia and Lydia was not simply a battle of armies. It was a collision between an emerging empire and an old order of wealth. The campaign culminated in the capture of Sardis, Lydia's capital. Croesus, once the symbol of unimaginable riches, was defeated, and with Lydia's fall, Persia gained control of Anatolia and the Greek cities along the coast. The world was beginning to understand. Persia was no longer regional. It was imperial. Yet conquest was only part of the story. What made the Achaemenids extraordinary was not simply that they expanded, but how they ruled. Cyrus did not impose destruction upon the lands he conquered. He sought stability. Local traditions were often respected. Subject peoples were not automatically crushed beneath Persian identity, but woven into the empire's growing fabric. This approach was revolutionary in an age where conquest usually meant annihilation. And it was precisely this approach that allowed Persia to expand so rapidly. The empire was becoming not only large, but sustainable. The Achaemenid dynasty was laying foundations, alliances, governance, integration. Persia was learning to hold diversity. And ahead, looming like a jewel of civilization, stood the greatest prize of all: Babylon. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a world symbol. Its walls were legendary, its temples ancient, its gods powerful in the imagination of the Near East. To conquer Babylon was to conquer the heart of Mesopotamian civilization itself. But Babylon was also vulnerable. Its king, Nabonidus, was unpopular among many of his subjects. Religious tensions simmered. The empire was unstable. Cyrus saw the opening. And so, as the 540 BCE unfolded, Persia moved toward its defining moment. The Achaemenid rise was accelerating, no longer a quiet gathering of tribes, but a storm of transformation sweeping across the ancient world. The dynasty that began in small Anshan was now stepping toward global history. And Babylon, the city of kings, stood waiting in the path of Persia's ascent. In the twilight of the 6th century BCE, the ancient world watched as a new force approached the heart of civilization. Babylon stood ahead like a monument to human achievement, its massive walls rising from the Mesopotamian plain, its temples reaching toward the heavens, its streets filled with merchants, priests, and the weight of centuries. To conquer Babylon was not merely to seize territory. It was to inherit history itself. Yet Babylon was not the invincible city it appeared to be. Beneath its grandeur lay fractures. King Nabonidus had alienated powerful priesthoods, spent long years away from the capital, and weakened the unity of his realm. The people of Babylon, proud as they were, lived under tensions that made the empire vulnerable. And Cyrus understood something that few conquerors ever grasped. Empires do not fall only by swords. They fall when legitimacy collapses. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched into Mesopotamia. The Persian army moved with discipline, not chaos. Battles occurred, but Babylon's fall was swift, almost shockingly so. The gates opened, resistance faded, and the city that had once ruled the Near East passed into Persian hands. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a ruler presenting himself as a restorer of order. He respected local traditions, honored temples, and allowed displaced peoples, most famously the Jewish exiles, to return to their homelands. This was not weakness. It was imperial genius. Because Cyrus was building something larger than conquest. He was building a system. The Achaemenid Empire was now the greatest political entity the world had yet seen, stretching from the mountains of Iran through Mesopotamia and Anatolia, reaching toward the edges of Central Asia. And yet, what defined this empire was not simply its size. It was its structure. The Achaemenids understood that diversity could not be crushed into uniformity. Instead, it had to be governed. Cultures, languages, religions, all were allowed space within the imperial framework, so long as loyalty remained. This approach turned Persia into something unprecedented, a multinational empire held together not only by force, but by administration, tolerance, and strategy. The dynasty that began as minor kings in Anshan had transformed into the rulers of the known world. The rise of the Achaemenids was one of history's great metamorphoses. Scattered tribes becoming a nation becoming an empire becoming a new model of governance. From the plateau's harsh beginnings, Persia had stepped into global destiny. And Cyrus, at the center of this transformation, became more than a conqueror. He became an architect of empire. Yet even as Persia rose, the story was only beginning. An empire this vast demanded organization beyond the vision of one man. Roads would need to bind the distances. Provinces would need governance. Kings would need systems strong enough to outlast them. The Achaemenid Empire had been born in the brilliance of Cyrus's rise. Now it would face its next challenge: how to endure. Because conquest creates an empire in years, but administration sustains it for centuries. And in the next chapter, Persia's imperial dream will be forged into order and law under the reign of Darius the Great, who will transform Cyrus's conquest into the machinery of a world empire. Thus, from the rise of one dynasty came the birth of an age, an empire not only of power, but of vision, standing beneath the endless skies of history. Chapter 3. Cyrus and the Empire of Mercy. In the dawn of empire, when conquest was measured in fire and chains, when cities fell beneath iron and their people were carried away like spoils, the ancient world believed power could only speak one language: fear. Across Mesopotamia, Assyrian kings had carved their victories into stone with brutal clarity. Rebellions crushed, captives impaled, nations erased. Babylon's rulers had inherited grandeur, but also the same old imperial certainty that domination was the natural order of history. And yet, in the highlands of Iran, a different kind of ruler emerged. A king whose name would endure not only for what he conquered, but for how he chose to rule. Cyrus. Cyrus the Great did not begin his life as a world emperor. He was born into a Persia still young in its unity, still rising from tribal roots, still overshadowed by older civilizations. The Iranian plateau had forged his people through hardship, through mountains that demanded resilience and deserts that punished weakness. But Cyrus carried within him something rare: vision beyond survival. By the mid-6th century BCE, Persia was transforming. Cyrus had already achieved what once seemed impossible, overthrowing the Median king Astyages and uniting the Iranian peoples beneath Achaemenid rule. The Medes, once masters of the plateau, became partners in a larger imperial structure. This was the first sign of Cyrus's unusual instinct. He did not build by annihilation. He built by incorporation. Where other conquerors destroyed rival elites, Cyrus absorbed them. Where others ruled through humiliation, he ruled through continuity. Persia's rise was not only a military phenomenon, it was an administrative and moral one. And the world beyond Iran began to tremble. To the west lay Lydia, wealthy and proud, ruled by Croesus, whose gold was legendary. Cyrus defeated him and took Sardis, extending Persian reach to the shores of the Aegean. To the east and north, Persian influence spread across the Iranian world. But the greatest prize of all lay in the heart of Mesopotamia: Babylon. Babylon was not merely a city. It was an ancient symbol of kingship, of civilization, of divine authority. Its walls were said to be unbreakable, its temples the center of cosmic order. To conquer Babylon was to inherit the prestige of the oldest world. Yet Babylon was vulnerable. Its king, Nabonidus, had alienated powerful priesthoods. He had spent years away from the capital. Religious tensions simmered beneath the surface. The people of Babylon, proud as they were restless. Cyrus approached not only with armies, but with understanding. In 539 BCE, the Persian forces moved into Mesopotamia. The campaign was swift, disciplined, almost eerily controlled. Babylon did not fall in a storm of destruction. It fell with a strange quietness, as if the city itself recognized the inevitability of history. The gates opened. The empire changed hands. And Cyrus entered Babylon not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a ruler presenting himself as a liberator. He honored the city's temples. He respected its traditions. He restored religious institutions. He declared that the gods of Babylon had chosen him to bring order. This was politics, yes, but it was also something deeper, an imperial philosophy that conquest did not require cruelty. One of the most enduring examples of this was Cyrus's policy toward displaced peoples. Under Babylonian rule, many communities had been uprooted, carried into exile as instruments of control. Cyrus reversed this practice. He allowed captives to return home, to rebuild their sanctuaries, to reclaim their identities. Among them were the Jewish exiles, permitted to return to Jerusalem. In an age when empire was built on forced suffering, Cyrus introduced something extraordinary: mercy as governance. This was not softness. It was strength of a different kind. Because Cyrus understood that an empire could not endure through terror alone. Fear creates obedience, but it also creates rebellion. Respect creates stability. Tolerance creates loyalty. And so Persia, under Cyrus, became something unprecedented. The first true multinational empire, an empire not of one people crushing all others, but of many peoples held together beneath a single imperial order. It was an empire with a soul. And Cyrus, standing at its center, became more than a conqueror. He became an architect of humane power. Beneath the shadow of Babylon's towering walls, Cyrus's conquest marked more than a military triumph. It marked a shift in the very meaning of empire. For centuries, the ancient Near East had known rulers who conquered to dominate, who enslaved to control, who ruled by reminding the defeated that their suffering was permanent. The Assyrians had perfected terror as statecraft. Babylon had inherited the practice of exile and forced displacement. Power was measured by how completely the conquered were broken. But Cyrus introduced a different rhythm into history. He did not erase the worlds he conquered. He preserved them. This was not sentimentality. It was strategy, but it was also vision. Cyrus understood that the strength of Persia would not lie only in Persian arms, but in Persian legitimacy, its ability to govern vast diversity without constant revolt. And so, after Babylon, the empire of the Achaemenids became something unprecedented in scale and complexity. From the Aegean coast to the Iranian plateau, from the highlands of Anatolia to the fertile rivers of Mesopotamia, Cyrus now ruled peoples of countless languages and traditions: Lydians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, Syrians, Jews, Greeks, and many more. The question that haunted every empire now confronted him: how can one king rule many worlds? Cyrus answered not with uniformity, but with respect. Local elites were often maintained rather than destroyed. Religious institutions were protected. Temples were restored. The gods of subject peoples were honored, not mocked. Cyrus presented himself as a king chosen not only by Persia's divine order, but as a rightful ruler within the cultural frameworks of those he governed. This policy was immortalized in what later became known as the Cyrus Cylinder, an inscription written in Babylonian cuneiform. In it, Cyrus spoke of restoring sanctuaries, returning displaced peoples, and ruling with justice. Modern interpretations have sometimes elevated it into the language of human rights, though scholars remind us it was also imperial propaganda in the style of Mesopotamian kings. Yet even within that context, Cyrus's tone was distinct. He portrayed conquest as restoration, empire as order, kingship as responsibility. And this responsibility extended beyond Babylon. Cyrus continued to expand Persian influence across Central Asia and the eastern frontiers, securing the borders of the empire against nomadic threats. These campaigns were harsher, shaped by the realities of steppe warfare, but they were part of the same imperial necessity. An empire could not survive if its edges remained unstable. Yet Cyrus was never simply a warrior king. He was an organizer of worlds. The foundations of Achaemenid administration were taking shape even in his reign. Provinces were beginning to form, tribute systems emerging, communication routes expanding. Persia was learning to govern distance. And perhaps most remarkable of all was how Cyrus's reputation spread. To the Greeks, he was remembered as an extraordinary ruler, even by those who would later become Persia's enemies. Greek writers, though shaped by their own biases, often described Cyrus with admiration, as disciplined, wise, almost ideal in kingship. To the peoples of Mesopotamia, he was the king who restored temples. To the Jewish tradition, he became a divinely appointed liberator. Few conquerors in history have been remembered with such complexity. Because Cyrus's empire was not built only on fear. It was built on an idea. That power could be paired with restraint. That conquest did not require humiliation. That an empire might endure not only through armies, but through legitimacy. Persia, under Cyrus, became more than a territorial expansion. It became a new model of rule. A multinational empire held together by administration, tolerance, and vision. Yet even as Cyrus's star rose higher, history carried its eternal warning. No ruler, however extraordinary, is immortal. Empires must eventually face the question of succession, stability, and endurance beyond one man. Cyrus had given Persia its soul. But could that soul survive the future? The empire was vast. The stakes were immense. And Cyrus's final chapter was approaching, one that would seal his legacy forever. In the final years of Cyrus's reign, the Persian Empire stood as the greatest power the world had yet witnessed. From the mountains of Iran to the rivers of Mesopotamia, from Anatolia's coasts to the distant frontiers of Central Asia, Persia was no longer a rising kingdom. It was the center of the ancient world. And at its heart stood Cyrus, the king who had conquered more than cities. He had conquered the very logic of empire. Yet history is never satisfied with triumph alone. Every empire, no matter how visionary, must confront the fragility of human life. The same king who seemed destined to rule forever was still mortal, still bound to the uncertainties of war and time. In the northeast, beyond the settled lands, lived nomadic peoples whom the Persians called the Masagetai, steppe warriors of fierce independence. The empire's borders, vast as they were, could never rest completely secure. Cyrus, even in his later years, remained a ruler in motion, compelled to stabilize the edges of his domain. It was during one of these campaigns around 530 BCE that Cyrus met his end. The details are uncertain, filtered through the imperfect lens of Greek historians like Herodotus. Accounts differ. Some speak of battle against the Masagetai and their queen, Tomiris. Others suggest alternate circumstances. What remains historically clear is this. Cyrus died on campaign, far from Babylon's temples and Persia's palaces. The king who had built an empire with mercy did not die in comfort. He died, as the ancient world's rulers often did, beneath the open sky of war. And yet, death did not diminish his legacy. Because Cyrus left behind something more enduring than conquest. He left behind an imperial philosophy. His successors inherited not only territory, but a model of governance. An empire held together through tolerance, respect for local traditions, and administrative order. Cyrus had shown that power could be paired with restraint, that kingship could claim legitimacy through justice rather than terror alone. This did not mean the Persian Empire was modern in its morality. It remained an empire built through expansion and hierarchy, But within the context of the ancient world, Cyrus's approach was extraordinary. He was remembered differently. Babylon remembered him as a restorer. The Jewish tradition remembered him as a liberator. Even Greek thinkers, future enemies of Persia, often remembered Cyrus as an ideal king. Few rulers in history have achieved such a reputation across cultures. This is why Cyrus's name echoes beyond archaeology and chronology. Because in him, empire briefly revealed another possibility. That conquest might not require cruelty. That diversity might be governed without erasure. That power might carry responsibility. Persia, under Cyrus, became an empire with a soul, multinational, expansive, and surprisingly durable. The foundations he laid would allow the Achaemenid Empire to endure for 2 centuries, becoming the model against which later empires measured themselves. But Cyrus's death also marked a transition. An empire built by one man's vision now had to become an empire sustained by systems. The Persian world was vast, complex, and vulnerable to disorder, if not organized with precision. The age of conquest was giving way to the age of administration. And so, as Cyrus passed into history, the empire stood at a crossroads. It could fragment like so many realms before it, or it could transform into something even stronger, a machinery of governance spanning continents. That transformation would come under the reign of Darius the Great, where Cyrus had given Persia its soul. Darius would give it structure: royal roads, satrapies, taxation, law, an imperial system designed to hold the world together. Thus the story continues. From mercy to order. From vision to administration. From the life of one extraordinary king to the enduring architecture of empire. And in the next chapter, Persia's vast dominion will be forged into an organized world state, as Darius rises to shape the empire into permanence beneath the shadow of eternity. Chapter 4. Kings of Roads and Order. In the aftermath of Cyrus's death, the Persian Empire stood vast and astonishing, an empire born from vision, conquest, and mercy. Its borders stretched farther than any kingdom before it, binding together deserts, rivers, mountains, and seas beneath a single imperial horizon. Yet history carries a quiet truth. An empire is not secured by conquest alone. It is secured by what comes after. Because to take land is one thing. To hold the world together is another. When Cyrus fell on campaign around 530 BCE, the empire he left behind was powerful, but still young. It was held together by loyalty to his name, by the momentum of expansion, and by the fragile unity of peoples who had only recently become subjects of Persia. His son, Cambyses II, inherited this immense realm. He continued Persia's outward reach, conquering Egypt in 525 BCE and bringing the ancient Nile kingdom under Achaemenid control. For a moment, Persia seemed unstoppable, its banners flying from Central Asia to North Africa. But beneath the surface, instability grew. Cambyses died suddenly in 522 BCE under uncertain circumstances, far from the imperial heartland. And with his death, the empire trembled. Rebellions erupted across the provinces. Kings and pretenders rose in distant regions claiming thrones, declaring independence, testing whether Persia's unity was real or merely the shadow of Cyrus's greatness. The empire faced its first great crisis. Could it survive without its founder? It was in this moment of fracture, when Persia seemed poised to unravel, that a new figure emerged, one who would not only save the empire, but transform it into something stronger than conquest had ever created. Darius. Darius the Great was not Cyrus's son. He was a member of the wider Achaemenid royal house, a man of ambition and discipline, shaped by the realities of imperial power. In 522 BCE, after a turbulent struggle for legitimacy, Darius seized the throne. His reign began not with peace, but with fire. Across the empire, Rebellions burned, from Babylon to Media, from Elam to Egypt. Provinces that had once bowed to Cyrus now sought freedom in the uncertainty of succession. Darius responded with ruthless speed. He marched, fought, crushed revolts, and reasserted Persian authority. In inscriptions like the Behistun relief, carved high into a cliff face, Darius recorded these victories, presenting himself as the chosen king who restored order against chaos. But what defined Darius was not only that he reclaimed the empire, it was what he understood next. Conquest creates an empire. Administration sustains it. Darius looked out across Persia's immense diversity, dozens of peoples, languages, religions, economies, and recognized the challenge that would determine Persia's future. How does one king govern many worlds? The answer would become his genius. Darius began to transform Persia from a conquest empire into an administrative machine. He divided the realm into provinces known as satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a regional administrator responsible for tribute, justice, and stability. These satraps were powerful, but they were not independent kings. They were watched by royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, ensuring loyalty remained unbroken. This was empire as structure, not chaos, not mere domination. A system. Darius standardized taxation, creating predictable tribute rather than arbitrary plunder. He introduced imperial coinage, including the gold daric, strengthening trade across the empire's vast distances. And then, perhaps most famously, he built roads. Not simple paths, but arteries of empire. The royal road stretched from Susa to Sardis over 2,500 kilometers, allowing messages, soldiers, merchants, and officials to travel with unprecedented speed. Along it were stations, fresh horses, and imperial couriers. Herodotus would later write with awe that nothing moved faster than Persian messengers. In this, Persia became more than armies. It became communication, law, infrastructure, order. Darius was building an empire that could endure beyond the life of any single king. And beneath his reign, Persia reached toward its greatest scale, stretching east to the Indus Valley, west toward Europe, south into Egypt, north into Central Asia. The empire became a living organism, held together by roads and systems, by administration and law. True power, Darius understood, was not only in taking the world, but in holding it wisely. Beneath the vast canopy of Persia's dominion, Darius understood that empire was not a monument. It was a machine, and machines require order, rhythm, and constant maintenance. The world he ruled was immense beyond comprehension. From the windswept plains of the Indus Valley to the mountain passes of Anatolia, from the temples of Babylon to the sands of Egypt, Persia contained civilizations older than Persia itself. Each province carried its own gods, languages, economies, and memories of independence. To govern such diversity demanded more than military strength. It demanded architecture of power. The satrapy system became the spine of this imperial structure. Darius organized the empire into roughly 20 major provinces, each with defined obligations. Tribute was assessed carefully, not as random extraction, but as standardized taxation. Grain, silver, horses, textiles, each region contributed according to its capacity. This created predictability. Predictability created stability, and stability allowed Persia to endure. Yet Darius also knew that provincial governors could become threats. A satrap with too much autonomy could dream of kingship. So Darius layered the empire with oversight, military commanders separate from civil governors, royal secretaries reporting directly to the king, inspectors traveling the provinces. The empire was watched. The empire was connected. The king was present even in distant lands. And nothing symbolized this presence more than the roads. The royal road was not merely infrastructure. It was imperial philosophy, carved into earth and stone. It bound the empire together like veins carrying lifeblood. Couriers could cross vast distances in days rather than weeks. Orders from the king could reach the edges of the world with unprecedented speed. This was the difference between a loose empire of conquest and a centralized world state. Persia became a network, a system of movement and communication that made distance itself an instrument of rule. Trade flourished along these routes. Merchants carried goods from India, Arabia, Egypt, and Greece through Persian lands. Markets expanded, cultures mingled. The empire was not only political, it was economic and civilizational. Darius strengthened this further through standardized coinage. The gold daric became a symbol of imperial unity, trusted across the ancient world. With stable currency came stronger commerce, and with commerce came wealth flowing into the imperial heart. But Darius's ambition was not only administrative, it was monumental. At Susa and Persepolis, he began constructing imperial capitals unlike anything the world had seen. Persepolis, in particular, was designed as a ceremonial center of empire, a place where subject peoples would bring tribute, where stone reliefs would immortalize the unity of Persia's dominion. Columns rose like forests of carved marble. Stairways were etched with delegations from every corner of the empire. Medes, Egyptians, Lydians, Babylonians, each rendered not as slaves, but as participants in imperial order. Persepolis was propaganda in stone, a statement that Persia was not merely conquering. It was organizing civilization. Darius also expanded Persia's reach. Campaigns pushed into the Indus region, bringing parts of northwest India into the imperial system. In the west, Persia pressed into Thrace and Macedonia, approaching the Greek world more closely than ever before. And with this expansion came tension, because beyond the Aegean lay the fiercely independent Greek city-states, small compared to Persia, yet culturally proud, unwilling to bow. Darius's empire, for all its organization, was now brushing against a new frontier of resistance. The administrative machine was strong. The roads were built. The empire was vast. But the question remained, could even Persia's system hold against the storms that waited beyond its borders? Darius had forged the empire into permanence. Yet permanence invites challenge. And in the next phase of Persia's story, the king of roads and order would face the first great collision between Persia and Greece, an encounter that would echo through Western memory forever. In the reign of Darius the Great, Persia became something the ancient world had never fully witnessed before. A true imperial system. Not merely a kingdom swollen by conquest, not merely a collection of lands bound by fear, but an organized world state, administered, connected, and sustained through law, infrastructure, and communication. Where Cyrus had given Persia its soul, Darius gave it permanence. The empire now stretched across 3 continents. Its borders touched the Indus River in the east, the deserts of Libya in the west, the steppes of Central Asia in the north, and the Nile Valley in the south. Dozens of peoples lived beneath its banner, speaking different tongues, worshipping different gods, carrying different histories. And yet, the empire held, because it was engineered to hold. Satrapies governed the provinces. Tribute flowed predictably. Inspectors watched for disloyalty. Couriers crossed the royal road with messages faster than any empire before. Coinage unified trade. Persepolis rose as a ceremonial heart, a vision of unity carved into stone. Persia was no longer simply powerful. It was structured, and structure is the secret of endurance. Darius understood that empires collapse not only from enemies, but from internal fracture. His reforms were designed to prevent that fracture, to ensure that the king's authority reached even the farthest edges of the world. In many ways, the Achaemenid Empire became the blueprint for future imperial governance. Later empires, the Romans, the Byzantines, even modern states, would echo elements of Persia's administrative genius: provincial systems, roads, taxation, centralized authority. The Persian Empire was not only conquering history, it was teaching history how empire could function. Yet no system, however refined, exists in a vacuum. Power invites resistance. And as Persia expanded westward, the empire's vast machinery began to press against a world that did not fit easily into satrapies and tribute. The Greek city-states. Small, fragmented, endlessly quarrelsome, yet fiercely protective of autonomy. They were not an empire. They had no king of kings. But they possessed something Persia could not simply absorb: a stubborn independence rooted in local identity. The first sparks came in Ionia, where Greek cities under Persian rule rebelled at the turn of the 5th century BCE. This Ionian revolt was not merely a provincial disturbance. It was a warning that the empire's western frontier carried a different kind of challenge. Darius responded as an imperial ruler must, with force, with reassertion of order. The revolt was crushed. But the involvement of Athens and Eretria planted a seed of confrontation. Persia, vast and organized, now turned its gaze across the Aegean. The king of Rhodes and order began to consider not only administration, but punishment, and perhaps expansion. Because Persia's system was built to hold diversity, but it was also built to demand loyalty. Rebellion could not be tolerated, not in an empire that depended on stability. Thus, in the final years of Darius's reign, the empire stood at a threshold. Internally, it was strong, its foundations deeper than any empire before. Externally, it was approaching collision. The roads were complete. The provinces were secured. The imperial machine was alive. And now, beyond the sea, awaited a world that would test Persia's limits in battle and memory. The age of administration was giving way to the age of conflict. The empire that could govern continents would soon march into one of the most famous struggles of antiquity. Thus ended the chapter of roads and order. And thus began the chapter of fire and war. For in the next chapter, Persia steps into its legendary confrontation with Greece, as Xerxes and the Persian Wars shape the fate of empires beneath the gaze of history. Chapter 5. Fire, Faith, and Zoroastrian Vision. In the heart of the Persian Empire, beyond the stone of palaces and the reach of armies, there burned something older than conquest: a flame. Not merely the flame of hearths or torches, but the flame of meaning, the spiritual fire that gave Persia its identity beneath the vastness of empire. For Persia was never only a political machine. It was a moral universe. Its kings did not rule solely as conquerors. They ruled as guardians of order, as defenders of truth, as figures bound to a cosmic responsibility that stretched beyond the material world. To understand Persia, one must look not only at its roads and satrapies, not only at Persepolis rising in carved splendor, but at the invisible architecture of belief that held the empire together. Because at the center of Persian civilization stood an ancient vision: the struggle between truth and chaos. Long before the Achaemenids ruled the world, the Iranian plateau had nurtured spiritual traditions shaped by open skies, harsh landscapes, and the constant confrontation between survival and destruction. In this world, nature itself felt alive with forces: light and darkness, fertility and drought, order and disorder. And from these deep roots emerged one of history's most influential religious traditions: Zoroastrianism. The precise life and dates of the prophet Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, remain debated by scholars, lost in the long mist of early antiquity. But what is clear is the revolutionary nature of the message that took shape in ancient Iran. It was not a faith of endless gods battling for petty power. It was a vision of moral choice. At its center stood Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, representing truth, order, and creation. Opposed to him was Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, embodying chaos, deceit, and ruin. Human beings were not passive subjects in this cosmic drama. They were participants. Life was a battlefield of ethics, where every action mattered, where truth was not abstract, but sacred. This concept was profound, that morality was woven into the structure of the universe itself. In Zoroastrian thought, the world was divided between Asha, truth, righteousness, cosmic order, and Druj, lie, deception, chaos. To choose rightly was to align oneself with creation. To choose falsely was to aid destruction. And thus, religion became not merely ritual, but responsibility. When the Achaemenids rose to imperial power, this spiritual worldview did not remain confined to priests or fireside hymns. It entered kingship. Persian rulers presented themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda, ruling not simply through human authority, but through divine mandate. In royal inscriptions, Darius and Xerxes spoke repeatedly of Ahura Mazda as the source of their legitimacy. The king was not merely the strongest man. He was the protector of Asha, the guardian of order against chaos. This intertwining of faith and rule gave the Persian Empire a unique ideological depth. Where other empires ruled through fear alone, Persia framed its rule as part of a moral structure. This did not mean Persia was without violence or ambition. It was an empire, shaped by power like all others. But Persia clothed power in meaning. And symbols mattered. Among the most enduring symbols of Zoroastrianism was fire. Fire was not worshipped as a god, but revered as purity, as light, as the visible presence of truth. In fire temples, sacred flames were kept burning, tended carefully, representing the unbroken continuity of order. In the flickering glow of these fires, Persian spirituality found its center, illumination against darkness, purity against corruption. The empire's vast diversity, its many peoples and tongues, was held together not only by administration, but by this deeper Persian self-understanding, that the world was a struggle, and Persia's kings stood as defenders of truth. Thus, beneath the grandeur of Persepolis and the endless roads of Darius, Persia's greatest strength was not only in what it built, but in what it believed. For civilizations endure not through wealth alone, but through ideas that outlast stone. Beneath the golden stone of imperial Persia, the sacred flame was more than symbol. It was identity. In a world where empires rose through force, Persia rose with an inner philosophy, one that framed existence itself as a moral struggle. This vision did not remain abstract theology. It shaped governance, culture, and the way Persians understood their place in history. For the Achaemenid kings, ruling was not simply political. It was cosmic. When Darius inscribed his victories at Behistun, he did not claim triumph through strength alone. He claimed it through truth. Again and again he spoke of the lie as the enemy, the force that brought rebellion, disorder, and chaos into the world. His enemies were not merely rivals, they were aligned with Druj, with falsehood. Thus, Persian kingship became inseparable from Zoroastrian moral order. The king was expected to uphold justice, maintain stability, and protect the world from collapse into chaos. In this sense, Persian imperial ideology was not only about domination, but about preservation of cosmic balance. This belief shaped the empire's remarkable tolerance. Persia ruled over countless religions, Babylonian temples, Egyptian priesthoods, Greek sanctuaries, Jewish traditions. The empire did not demand uniform worship. Instead, it allowed local faiths to endure, so long as political loyalty remained. This was not modern pluralism, but it was extraordinary for its time. The Persian worldview saw order as something that could include diversity so long as chaos was resisted. And at the center of Persian ritual life remained fire. Fire temples became places of purity and continuity. Priests tended sacred flames, ensuring they never died, symbolizing the endurance of truth. Fire represented light against darkness, creation against destruction, Asha against Dir-Uj. The sacred fire was not merely religious, it was cultural. It reminded Persians that their empire was not only a material achievement, but a spiritual responsibility. Zoroastrian ethics emphasized good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and active moral life. This ethic shaped Persian identity as more than conquest. To live rightly was to participate in the triumph of order, and the influence of these ideas would ripple far beyond Persia itself. Zoroastrianism introduced concepts that would echo through later world faiths: the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the idea of judgment after death, the hope of a final restoration of the world. These themes would later appear in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, carried across centuries of cultural exchange. Persia, often remembered only for wars and palaces, was also a spiritual bridge in human history. An empire of ideas. Even the empire's art reflected this worldview. Reliefs at Persepolis depict not chaos, but harmony. Delegations of many peoples walking in ordered procession, symbolizing unity under the king's just rule. The empire presented itself as a structured cosmos, with the king at its center upheld by Ahura Mazda. This was propaganda, yes, but it was also belief. Persia understood itself as more than power. It understood itself as purpose. Yet faith, like empire, carries tension. The cosmic battle between truth and chaos was not only theology, it was a lens through which Persians interpreted rebellion, war, and destiny. As Persia expanded westward, it would soon face a world that did not share its imperial order, the fiercely independent Greek city-states whose resistance would become legendary. The sacred flame still burned. The empire still stood in balance. But beyond the horizon, chaos and conflict were gathering. In the vast span of the Achaemenid Empire, roads carried messengers, satraps governed provinces, armies guarded frontiers. But beneath all of this, Persia's deepest foundation was invisible. It was belief. Fire, faith, and moral vision gave the empire a soul that administration alone could never provide. Persia was not only a structure of power, it was an idea of order in a world that often seemed ruled by chaos. Zoroastrianism offered Persia something rare among ancient empires: a universal ethical framework. The struggle between Asha and Dir-Uj was not confined to temples. It was woven into kingship, law, and identity. The king ruled not simply as conqueror, but as guardian of truth. This spiritual depth shaped Persia's enduring legacy. Empires are often remembered for the lands they seized, the battles they fought, the monuments they left behind. But Persia's greatest influence was also philosophical: the belief that human life carried moral responsibility, that history itself was part of a cosmic struggle toward order. The sacred fire burning in temples was a reminder of continuity, light surviving against darkness, purity maintained against corruption. It symbolized a civilization that sought meaning beyond wealth and conquest. And the ideas Persia carried did not remain within Persian borders. Through centuries of contact and exchange, Zoroastrian concepts echoed outward: the moral dualism of good and evil, the hope of renewal, the idea of judgment and restoration. Persia became not only an empire of territory, but an empire of thought. Yet the Persian worldview also carried an unavoidable tension. If the king was defender of truth, then rebellion became more than politics. It became chaos. If Persia embodied order, then resistance could be framed as disorder. And as Persia's imperial system pressed westward, it would meet societies that did not see Persian rule as cosmic harmony, but as foreign domination. Beyond the Aegean Sea lay the Greek city-states, small, divided, fiercely proud. They did not worship Ahura Mazda. They did not imagine kingship as cosmic guardianship. Their political identity was rooted in autonomy, in the refusal to bow. The collision between these worlds was approaching. Persia with its moral universe of order and truth. Greece with its stubborn independence and fractured freedom. Two civilizations carrying different visions of power, destiny, and identity. Thus, the sacred flame still burned brightly at the heart of empire, illuminating Persia's sense of purpose. But history was moving toward confrontation. And the next chapter would not be written in temples or inscriptions. It would be written on battlefields. For soon, the Persian Empire, vast, organized, and spiritually anchored, would march into its most famous struggle, as Xerxes and the Persian Wars would test whether even an empire of truth could withstand the chaos of resistance. And so, from fire and faith, the story turns toward war, as Persia steps into the legendary clash that will echo across the ancient world forever. Chapter 6. Persia against Greece. Beneath the shadow of empires, the Achaemenid world had reached the shores of the unknown. To the east, Persia touched the Indus. To the south, it held Egypt. To the north, it watched the steppe. And to the west, beyond Anatolia's mountains and the blue expanse of the Aegean Sea, lay a fractured world of small city-states, restless, proud, and fiercely independent. Greece. To Persia, Greece was not yet the cradle of Western legend. It was a frontier, a distant edge of the imperial map, scattered with quarrelsome cities, trading ports, and islands that resisted the order of kings. Yet history would transform this frontier into one of antiquity's defining collisions. The Persian Wars were not born from inevitability. They were born from tension. In the late 6th century BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia along the coast of Asia Minor fell under Persian rule after the conquest of Lydia. These cities remained Greek in language and culture, but now existed within the Persian imperial system. Persia governed them through satraps and local tyrants, expecting tribute and loyalty as it did elsewhere. For many, this arrangement was tolerable. For others, it was unbearable. In 499 BCE, the Ionian Revolt erupted. Greek cities rose against Persian authority, fueled by resentment, ambition, and the dream of autonomy. They were not alone. Across the sea, Athens and Eretria sent aid, small forces, symbolic yet provocative. For Persia, this was not merely rebellion. It was disorder, chaos against imperial order. Cyrus the Great crushed the revolt with the full weight of empire. Miletus, once a jewel of Ionian culture, was destroyed. The rebellion ended in ashes. But the insult remained. Athens had intervened. A distant city-state had dared to challenge the King of Kings. Darius vowed retribution. Thus began Persia's first gaze toward Greece itself. In 490 BCE, Persian forces crossed the Aegean and landed at Marathon, near Athens. The Persians were experienced, disciplined, confident. Their empire had swallowed kingdoms far greater than this. Athens was small, but the Athenians fought with desperate intensity, defending not an empire but their independence. Against expectation, they won a stunning victory, driving Persia back. Marathon became legend. But for Persia, it was unfinished business. Darius died before he could launch another invasion. The task passed to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes inherited the largest empire on earth. He ruled from Persepolis, where stone reliefs depicted the unity of countless peoples beneath Persian order. Yet at the western edge of this vast dominion, Greece remained defiant. To Xerxes, the question was not simply revenge. It was completion. An empire that claimed universal order could not tolerate a rebellious frontier. Greece was small, but its resistance was symbolic. And so Xerxes prepared. What followed was one of the greatest mobilizations in ancient history. Persian armies gathered from across the empire: Medes, Persians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians, each contingent carrying its own weapons, clothing, and traditions. This was not merely Persia against Greece. It was the world's first multinational empire marching against a fractured coalition of city-states. Xerxes ordered bridges built across the Hellespont, binding Asia to Europe with engineering and ambition. He cut canals, supplied roads, organized fleets. The invasion of 480 BCE was not a raid. It was an imperial statement. The King of Kings was coming. Greece trembled. Some cities submitted. Others resisted. And in the narrow passes of Thermopylae, a small Greek force prepared to stand against the tide. Here, history would create one of its most enduring myths. But beneath the legend lay reality. Persia was not a faceless horde. It was an empire of order confronting resistance at its edge. The war was about power, yes, but also identity. The clash between imperial unity and local freedom, between the King of Kings and the stubborn cities of Greece. And the storm was only beginning. Beneath the burning sun of 480 BCE, the Persian Empire moved like a tide across the edge of Europe. Xerxes' invasion was immense, unprecedented, a convergence of peoples drawn from the breadth of empire. Persian nobles rode beside Median cavalry. Egyptian sailors manned ships alongside Phoenician mariners. Soldiers from Central Asia marched with weapons unfamiliar to Greek eyes. This was the imperial world in motion. And Greece, divided by rivalries and pride, faced the greatest force it had ever seen. Yet Greece did not stand entirely alone. In the face of Persia's advance, a fragile coalition formed. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and others, bound together not by unity of culture, but by fear of submission. The first great confrontation came at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was not a city. It was a narrow pass between mountain and sea, a corridor where Persia's numbers could not easily overwhelm. Here, the Spartans under King Leonidas, alongside other Greek allies, chose to make their stand. For days, they resisted. Persian troops attacked in waves. The Greeks held the line, shield against shield, bodies pressed into the narrow stone throat of the pass. The air filled with dust, sweat, and the metallic sound of bronze striking bronze. Thermopylae became legend, but the truth is harsher. Persia adapted. A path through the mountains was revealed, allowing Persian forces to outflank the Greeks. Leonidas and his remaining men fought to the death. The pass fell. The road to central Greece opened, and Xerxes marched onward. Athens, the proud city of Marathon, was abandoned by its people. The Persians entered and burned the Acropolis, flames rising over temples that would later become symbols of Western civilization. For Greece, it was devastation. For Persia, it was punishment and strategy, an empire enforcing obedience. Yet Xerxes' victory was not complete, because Athens' strength was not only in stone, it was in its fleet. Themistocles, the Athenian strategist, understood that Greece could not defeat Persia on land, but at sea, in narrow waters, Persia's vast fleet could become vulnerable. Thus the war shifted to Salamis. In the straits near the island, Greek ships lured the Persian navy into confined space. The Persian fleet, larger but less maneuverable, collided into chaos. Greek triremes struck with precision, ramming hulls, splintering wood, drowning men beneath the waves. Salamis was not merely a battle. It was a turning point. Persia's naval power was shattered. Xerxes, watching from the shore, saw the limits of imperial scale. The empire could gather countless ships, but coordination across such diversity was fragile. In narrow waters, Greek unity, however temporary, became lethal. After Salamis, Xerxes withdrew much of his army back toward Asia, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The war was not over, but Persia's aura of inevitability had cracked. The Greek world, battered and burning, had survived. And in survival, identity was forged. Yet the deeper truth remains. Persia was not simply a villainous invader of Greek memory. It was an empire defending its frontier logic, enforcing order against rebellion, seeking completion of its imperial horizon. The Persian Wars were not only battles of good versus evil, they were collisions of political worlds, imperial unity against city-state autonomy, and the final outcome would reshape both civilizations forever. In the wake of Salamis, the Persian invasion lost its sense of inevitability. The empire of Xerxes remained vast beyond imagination, its resources immense, its armies still powerful. But the war had revealed something history often hides beneath scale. Even the greatest empire has limits. Xerxes returned to Asia, leaving the campaign in Greece to his commanders. Persia had burned Athens, shattered resistance at Thermopylae, and demonstrated imperial might. Yet Greece had survived the storm, and survival became defiance. In 479 BCE, the struggle reached its final turning point. Persian forces under Mardonius faced the allied Greek armies at Plataea. Here, on land, the Greeks fought not as isolated cities, but as a coalition bound by desperation. The battle was brutal. Persian infantry, disciplined and courageous, clashed against heavily armored hoplites. The outcome was not predetermined by virtue, but by circumstance, terrain, and the shifting realities of war. When the Persians were defeated at Plataea, the invasion ended. On the same day, Greek forces struck Persian positions at Mycale in Asia Minor, further breaking Persian influence along the Aegean frontier. The Persian Wars were over. Greece remained unconquered. And yet, Persia was not destroyed. This is the deeper truth often lost in later memory. The Persian Empire endured. Its heartlands remained untouched. Its administrative machine continued to govern continents. Xerxes returned to Persepolis, where the empire still functioned as the greatest state of the age. The wars were not the fall of Persia. They were the boundary of Persia. They marked the western limit of Achaemenid expansion. For Greece, these victories became foundational myths of freedom against empire. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, names that echoed for centuries, shaping Western identity. But for Persia, the conflict was a frontier war, costly and symbolic, yet not existential. Persia's story did not end on Greek shores. It continued eastward, southward, inward, into administration, culture, and imperial longevity. The Persian Wars shaped both civilizations in profound ways. For Greece, they fueled confidence, unity, and eventually Athenian dominance through the Delian League, an alliance that itself would become an empire in miniature. For Persia, they reinforced the challenges of governing distant frontiers and the reality that not all lands could be absorbed into imperial order. The wars revealed two different political visions. Persia, a multinational empire of kingship, administration, and cosmic order. Greece, a fragmented world of autonomous cities, bound by fierce local identity. Neither was purely heroic. Neither was purely villainous. History was more complex than later legend allowed. Persia was not simply an invader. It was a sophisticated empire confronting resistance at its edge. And Greece was not simply freedom. It was a world capable of its own domination and division. Thus, the Persian Wars stand as one of antiquity's defining collisions, not only of armies, but of identities. The Achaemenid Empire remained dim, luminous, enduring. But the dream of universal expansion had met a frontier it could not fully cross. And now, Persia turned inward again, toward its ceremonial heart, toward Persepolis, toward the splendor of empire at its height. Because even after war, the empire still stood. Columns still rose. Tribute still flowed. The king still ruled beneath Ahura Mazda. And in the next chapter, we return from battlefields to stone and ceremony, to the glittering imperial capital where Persia displayed itself as the center of civilization. For beyond the clash with Greece, Persia reached its zenith in the splendor of Persepolis, where empire became architecture, ritual, and eternal stone. Chapter 7. The Splendor of Persepolis. In the heart of the Persian Empire, far from the crashing waves of Salamis and the smoke of battlefields, there rose a city that was not built for war. It was built for eternity. Persepolis, a name that would echo through history like a half-buried dream. Columns against the sky, stairways carved with silent processions, stones still holding the memory of an empire that believed itself destined to endure forever. Persepolis was not a capital in the ordinary sense. It was not a city of crowded streets or daily commerce. It was not meant for ordinary life. It was a ceremonial heart, a stage of empire, a place where Persia displayed itself to the world. Its origins lay in the reign of Darius the Great, the king who transformed Persia from conquest into order. Darius understood that an empire of such scale required not only roads and satrapies, but symbols, monuments that could embody imperial unity in stone. And so, around 518 BCE, construction began on a terrace at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, near the homeland of the Persians themselves. Here, in the land of Pars, Darius envisioned a city unlike any other. Persepolis would not merely house a king. It would represent the empire. The terrace was immense, artificially raised, commanding the plain below. Upon it rose palaces, halls, stairways, and gates, structures designed not for defense, but for awe. The Gate of All Nations welcomed visitors beneath colossal guardian figures, winged bulls and mythical creatures carved with imperial authority. Beyond it lay the Apadana, the great audience hall, where the King of Kings received delegations from across the world. Columns soared like forests of stone, their capitals crowned with bulls and lions. Roofs stretched over vast spaces, creating an architecture of grandeur and openness. This was not merely Persian craftsmanship. It was imperial synthesis. Persepolis drew artisans and influences from across the empire. Mesopotamian relief traditions, Egyptian stonework, Ionian design elements. The empire's diversity was not only governed, it was built into the city itself. And the city's walls spoke in images. On the grand staircases, carved reliefs depict endless processions, Medes in folded garments, Egyptians bearing gifts, Lydians carrying vessels, Indians leading animals, Babylonians bringing textiles. Each delegation is shown not as slave, but as participant in imperial order. The empire walking in stone. This was Persia's message. Many peoples, one king. Many worlds, one empire. Persepolis was at its height most alive during ritual moments, especially the celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, when spring returned and the world was symbolically renewed. Delegations arrived bearing tribute, gold, incense, horses, ivory, precious cloth, each offering not only wealth, but acknowledgement of Persia's central authority. Languages mingled beneath the columns. Footsteps echoed on polished stone. Incense rose in the air. The king sat enthroned, the embodiment of imperial order beneath Ahura Mazda. Persepolis was not simply architecture. It was theater, a ritual of empire, a vision that Persia was not a fleeting conquest, but a cosmic structure meant to last. To stand in Persepolis was to stand at the center of the known world, and the Persians believed the center was permanent. The stone proclaimed stability. The reliefs proclaimed harmony. The columns proclaimed immortality. Persepolis was more than a city. It was a statement that Persia's empire was not only powerful, it was destined. Yet history, even at its most splendid, carries an undertone of fragility, because the higher the monument rises, the farther it can fall. Beneath the towering columns of Persepolis, the Persian Empire revealed itself not as a force of chaos, but as a civilization of order, ritual, and astonishing artistic brilliance. Persepolis was not built in haste. It was built deliberately over decades through the reigns of Darius, Xerxes, and their successors. Each king added new halls, new palaces, new reliefs, layering stone upon stone, as if constructing not merely a city, but an eternal archive of imperial identity. To walk its terraces was to walk through Persia's self-image. The Apadana Hall, the great audience chamber, stood as the empire's ceremonial core. Its columns rose nearly 20 meters high, supporting a roof that seemed to float above the earth. Here, the King of Kings received envoys and tribute in carefully choreographed ritual. One can imagine the scene, the vast space filled with light, banners shifting in the air, guards standing in disciplined silence. Delegations approached in ordered lines, bearing gifts from the farthest corners of the world. This was not random wealth. This was the empire made visible. Persepolis was designed to communicate a single truth. Persia ruled not through brutality alone, but through unity. The reliefs carved into stairways are among the most extraordinary artistic documents of antiquity. They do not depict massacres or humiliation. Instead, they show calm procession, peoples of different cultures bringing tribute, accompanied by Persian officials guiding them with dignity. The empire is portrayed as harmonious, a cosmic order. Even the symbolic imagery reinforces this worldview. Lions grappling bulls, representing the eternal cycle of seasons, struggle, and renewal. Persia saw itself as aligned with the rhythms of the universe. And above all, Persepolis was tied to kingship and faith. The king was not merely political. He was moral guardian, ruling under Ahura Mazda. Inscriptions across the city declare the king's legitimacy through divine favor. The architecture becomes theology in stone, order against chaos, permanence against disorder. Persepolis also reflected Persia's wealth and reach. Materials were drawn from across the empire: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Lydia, lapis from Central Asia, artisans from Egypt and Greece. The city was an imperial mosaic. Every stone carried the fingerprints of many peoples. Thus Persepolis was not only Persian, it was global. It was the empire gathered into one ceremonial space. Yet its purpose was not administration. That work was done in satrapies, in capitals like Susa and Babylon. Persepolis was different. It was symbolic. A place where the empire performed itself. A reminder to all who entered that Persia was the center of civilization, the axis around which the world turned. And for a time it worked. The Achaemenid Empire endured for generations. Tribute flowed. Roads connected continents. Kings ruled beneath sacred flame and divine order. Persepolis stood untouched, gleaming against the Zagros foothills. It seemed eternal. But eternity is the illusion empires always believe. Because monuments do not fall when they are weak. They fall when history shifts. And beyond Persia's western horizon, new forces were already stirring: restless kingdoms, rising Macedon, the distant figure of Alexander not yet born into legend. Persepolis was the empire at its height, but height is also the edge of decline. Persepolis stood as the empire's dream carved into stone. In its terraces and halls, Persia declared that it was not merely conquering land, but organizing civilization. The city was the physical embodiment of imperial confidence, its architecture vast, its reliefs harmonious, its rituals proclaiming unity beneath the King of Kings. For generations, Persepolis shimmered as a ceremonial heart. Delegations arrived from distant worlds, carrying tribute and acknowledgement. Languages mingled beneath soaring columns. The empire gathered year after year in ritual renewal. And in that gathering, Persia believed itself permanent. This was the illusion of splendor. That stone can defy time. That order can last forever. Yet history has never spared even the most magnificent monuments. Persepolis was not a fortress. It was not built for siege. It was built for ceremony, for awe, for eternity. And because of that, it carried a hidden vulnerability, Its greatness depended on the empire's stability. So long as Persia endured, Persepolis endured. But empires are living things. They age. They fracture. They face storms they cannot foresee. By the late 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire, still vast, still wealthy, had begun to weaken under internal struggles, court intrigue, and the sheer difficulty of governing such scale. The imperial machine remained powerful, but its unity was less absolute than in the days of Darius. And then, from the west, came the figure who would shatter Persia's eternity: Alexander of Macedon. When Alexander invaded Asia in 334 BCE, he did not come as a minor raider. He came as the spear point of a new age. His victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela tore through Persian defenses, driving the last Achaemenid king, Darius III, into flight. The empire that had once seemed unbreakable began to collapse with astonishing speed. And in 330 BCE, Alexander reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, the symbol of imperial destiny. What happened next became one of antiquity's most haunting images. Persepolis was plundered. And then, in an act still debated by historians, whether drunken impulse, calculated revenge for Athens, or symbolic destruction, fire was set to the palaces. Flames climbed the cedar beams. Smoke rose into the night. The columns, once witnesses to tribute and ritual, stood against the burning sky. Persepolis, the statement of eternity, was reduced to ruin. It was not merely a city burning. It was an empire's self-image collapsing. The fire that Persia had revered as sacred light became, in this moment, a fire of destruction. Thus ended the splendor. Yet even in ruin, Persepolis did not vanish. Its stones remained. Its reliefs endured. Its broken columns became silent testimony that Persia had once stood at the center of the world. And in this, Persepolis offers history one of its deepest lessons. Empires do not live forever in monuments. They live in memory, in ideas, in the civilizations they shape long after their palaces fall. Persepolis was the empire at its height, and also the empire's fragility made visible, because the higher the splendor rises, the more devastating the fall. And now, with Persepolis in ashes, Persia's story turns toward its next great transformation: the slow decline of Achaemenid power, the coming of Alexander, and the end of an age that had once believed itself eternal. For in the next chapter, we move from the glitter of imperial ceremony into the gathering shadows of decline, where Persia's golden thrones begin to crack beneath the weight of history. Chapter 8. Decline beneath golden thrones. In the aftermath of splendor, history often grows quiet. Persepolis still stood beneath the Zagros Mountains, its columns rising like a forest of stone, its stairways carved with images of harmony and tribute. The empire still stretched across continents, satraps still governed provinces, couriers still rode the royal road. From the outside, Persia seemed eternal. But beneath the golden surface, something was changing. The reign of Xerxes had marked both the height of Persian ambition and the limits of its expansion. The wars against Greece did not destroy Persia, but they revealed that even the King of Kings could not simply absorb every frontier into imperial order. And after Xerxes, the empire entered a different age, not of sudden collapse, but of slow erosion, because empires rarely fall in one dramatic moment. They fade. They weaken in corridors rather than battlefields. They fracture in palaces before they shatter on plains. The Persian Empire after Xerxes remained immense, wealthy, and powerful. Yet the unity forged by Cyrus and structured by Darius began to loosen under the weight of time, complacency, and internal struggle. Xerxes himself was assassinated in 465 BCE, murdered within the palace by court conspirators. The king of kings, once ruler of the world, fell not to foreign armies, but to intrigue behind imperial walls. It was a dark omen. For when an empire's greatest threats come from within, decline has already begun. The succession that followed was unstable. Kings rose amid uncertainty, their legitimacy questioned, their reigns shadowed by rival factions at court. The Persian palace became not only a center of authority, but a battlefield of whispers, eunuchs, nobles, generals, and royal family members competing for influence. The golden throne still shone, but it was no longer unshakable. Artaxerxes ruled after Xerxes, managing to maintain imperial control, yet even his reign revealed growing pressures. Revolts flared in Egypt. Greek influence expanded along the western frontier. Satraps in distant provinces began to act with greater autonomy. The empire was vast beyond imagination, and vastness itself was a burden. To govern from Susa or Persepolis meant ruling lands separated by deserts, mountains, and seas. Communication could be swift by ancient standards, but the sheer scale made unity fragile. Local governors grew powerful. Provincial loyalties weakened. The satrapies, once the empire's strength, carried a hidden danger: decentralization. A satrap with wealth, soldiers, and distance from the king could dream of independence. And dreams, over time, become rebellions. Persia also faced the slow corrosion of imperial complacency. The early Achaemenid kings had been conquerors, builders, reformers. Their successors inherited an empire already made. And inheritance can dull ambition. Court luxury deepened. Intrigue multiplied. The empire's immense wealth had flowed into palaces, while provincial unrest simmered at the edges. Persia remained formidable, but the dynamism of its rise was fading. Meanwhile, Greece, once a distant frontier problem, was evolving. Athens rose into a maritime empire after the Persian Wars. Sparta challenged it. Greek conflicts became constant, and Persia increasingly involved itself through diplomacy, subsidies, and manipulation rather than direct conquest. The King of Kings began to play Greek politics like a game, seeking balance rather than expansion. It was a sign of strategic realism, but also a sign that Persia's outward momentum had ended. And beyond Greece, new powers were stirring in the north. Macedon, still minor, still distant, but destined. The empire's golden age was not gone, but the cracks were appearing. Assassinations, court rivalries, provincial revolts, the slow weakening of central authority. Persia was still magnificent. Yet decline does not announce itself with collapse. It arrives like dust settling on marble, like silence growing in halls once filled with certainty. The golden throne remained, but beneath it, the foundations were beginning to tremble. Beneath the grandeur of Persia's palaces, the empire's decline unfolded not as a sudden disaster, but as a gradual unraveling, thread by thread, province by province, decade by decade. The Achaemenid system was still intact. Satrapies governed the lands. Tribute flowed to the royal court. The King of Kings still claimed divine legitimacy beneath Ahura Mazda. Yet the machinery that Darius had built required constant vigilance. And vigilance was fading. One of the empire's deepest vulnerabilities was succession. Each royal death opened the gates of uncertainty. The Persian court, immense in wealth and influence, became fertile ground for conspiracies. Eunuchs, nobles, and royal relatives maneuvered for power, and the throne often passed through violence rather than stability. The assassination of Xerxes had set a precedent. Even the King of Kings could fall within his own palace. This instability weakened the sacred aura of kingship. A ruler who must fear his own court cannot project unshakable authority to distant provinces. And the provinces were watching. Across the empire, satraps grew increasingly independent. Many governed territories larger than entire Greek kingdoms, commanding armies, collecting tribute, and ruling with near-royal authority. Distance from Persepolis allowed ambition to grow. Revolts became more frequent. Egypt, always difficult to hold, rebelled repeatedly during the 5th century BCE. Its ancient priesthoods and local elites resisted Persian rule, seeing themselves not as subjects of empire, but heirs of a civilization older than Persia itself. Persia could suppress these uprisings, but each rebellion drained resources and revealed fragility. In the West, Asia Minor became a zone of constant tension. Greek cities remained restless, and Persian satraps increasingly fought one another through intrigue and shifting alliances. The empire's frontier was no longer a clear boundary. It was a web of competing interests. And within Greece itself, Persia adopted a new strategy. Rather than invading again, Persia learned to influence. Gold replaced armies. Persian kings funded Greek rivals against one another, ensuring no single city-state became too strong. The empire became a silent hand behind Greek politics, manipulating balance rather than enforcing conquest. This was effective, but it also reflected a change in imperial character. Persia was no longer expanding. It was maintaining, and maintenance is the beginning of stagnation. Meanwhile, the royal court sank deeper into luxury. The wealth of continents flowed into Persepolis and Susa. Gold, jewels, textiles, incense. Kings lived surrounded by splendor, while the hard discipline of the early empire softened. The contrast between the imperial center and provincial realities grew sharper. At the edges, soldiers guarded harsh frontiers. In the heart, courtiers whispered in marble halls. The empire remained zim, but its unity depended increasingly on fragile loyalties rather than shared momentum. Yet even as Persia's internal cohesion weakened, the world beyond its borders was changing. In the north, Macedon was rising. Once dismissed as a rough kingdom on Greece's margins, it began to strengthen under new leadership. Its armies adopted Greek tactics. Its kings dreamed of larger horizons. Persia, consumed by internal management and Western diplomacy, did not yet recognize the storm gathering beyond the mountains. Empires often fall not because they are weak in power, but because they are slow to see what is coming. The Achaemenid Empire still stood as the greatest state on earth. But greatness had become weight. And weight, over time, becomes vulnerability. The cracks beneath the golden throne were widening. In the long twilight after Xerxes, the Persian Empire did not collapse. It endured. Its palaces still gleamed. Tributes still arrived from distant lands. Satraps still governed provinces. The King of Kings still ruled beneath the name of Ahura Mazda. And yet, history was changing the empire from within. The decline of Persia was not the story of a single defeat. It was the story of slow erosion, of an empire growing older, heavier, more fragile beneath its own magnificence. Court intrigue became a constant shadow. Kings rose and fell amid conspiracies. The sacred aura of monarchy weakened when rulers could be murdered not by foreign enemies, but by whispers in the palace corridors. Provincial unrest became routine. Egypt rebelled. Western satrapies competed. Local governors grew ambitious. And the empire's unity depended increasingly on force rather than loyalty. Persia remained powerful, but power alone could not restore the vitality of its founding age. The empire's greatest strength, its vastness, became its burden. Distance bred autonomy. Wealth bred complacency. Administration became maintenance rather than vision. The early Achaemenid kings had built an empire with purpose. Cyrus with mercy, Darius with order. Their successors inherited an empire already complete. And completion is dangerous. Because empires, once they stop expanding, must confront themselves. They must govern not only territories, but corruption, stagnation, and the fatigue of scale. Persia turned increasingly toward diplomacy rather than conquest. Persian gold shaped Greek politics. Balance replaced ambition. The empire's frontier was managed rather than transformed. It was still the greatest power on earth, but it was no longer the hungriest. And while Persia looked inward, the world beyond looked outward. Macedon rose in the north, forging a new kind of military state. Greek warfare evolved. New leaders emerged with ambitions that Persia had not yet fully understood. This is the timeless lesson of imperial decline. Empires rarely fall because they lose all strength. They fall because they lose momentum. They fall because their systems become rigid, their rulers become cautious, their vision becomes maintenance. Persia's golden throne still stood, but the cracks beneath it were now unmistakable. The empire was aging, and history was preparing its next great upheaval. For decline does not last forever. Eventually, it invites conquest. Eventually, it summons the storm. And in the next chapter, that storm will arrive in the form of a young Macedonian king, Alexander, whose invasion will not merely challenge Persia's borders, but shatter the Achaemenid world itself. The empire that once believed itself eternal will face the most dramatic fall in ancient history. For beyond the quiet decay of palaces and provinces, the footsteps of Alexander are already approaching, and Persia's age of kings is about to meet its reckoning. Chapter 9. Alexander and the Fall of Persia. In the late 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire still appeared immense beyond imagination. Its roads still stretched across continents. Its palaces still stood in ritual splendor. Its satraps still governed provinces larger than kingdoms. The King of Kings still ruled from the heart of Asia beneath the ancient name of Ahura Mazda. From the outside, Persia seemed eternal. But history had been gathering a storm. Far to the west, beyond the Aegean, beyond the fractured city-states of Greece, a new power had risen in the northern mountains. Macedon. Once dismissed as a rough frontier kingdom, Macedon had transformed under Philip II into a disciplined military state. Philip forged the Greek world into reluctant unity, reshaping warfare with the Sarissa phalanx, a formation of long spears that moved like an iron wall. And when Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, his son inherited not only a throne, but an ambition: Alexander. He was only 20 years old when he became king. Young, relentless, carrying within him the fierce energy of a generation that believed the world could be taken by force of will. To the Greeks, Persia was the old enemy, the empire that had once invaded their shores. To Alexander, Persia was more than revenge. It was destiny. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia, stepping onto Persian soil with an army small compared to Persia's resources, yet unmatched in discipline and leadership. The invasion began like a spark, but sparks can become fire. The first clash came at the Granicus River. Persian satraps attempted to stop Alexander at the water's edge, but Macedonian cavalry broke through, and the Persians fell back. Asia Minor began to open. For Persia, this was not yet catastrophe. The empire had faced rebellions, frontier wars, Greek unrest. But Alexander was different. He moved with speed that defied imperial expectation. He did not linger. He did not simply raid. He advanced. In 333 BCE, the storm met Persia's king, Darius III. Darius was the last Achaemenid ruler, inheriting an empire already weakened by court intrigue and provincial autonomy. He was not the architect of Persia's greatness, but the custodian of its fading inheritance. At Issus, near the Mediterranean coast, Darius confronted Alexander with a vast army. The Persian king stood amid splendor, chariots, cavalry, noble banners, believing sheer scale could crush this young invader. But battle is not won by numbers alone. Alexander struck at the center with terrifying precision. Macedonian discipline shattered Persian lines. Darius fled the field, leaving behind his family and royal treasure. It was not merely defeat, it was humiliation. For the King of Kings, flight was symbolic collapse. The aura of Persian invincibility cracked. Alexander marched south. He took Phoenician cities, besieged Tyre in brutal determination, then entered Egypt, where he was welcomed as liberator and crowned pharaoh. Persia's western provinces were falling away like leaves in a storm. Yet the empire's heart still remained. Darius gathered another army, larger still, drawn from the depths of Asia. This was Persia's last stand. In 331 BCE, on the plains of Gaugamela, near modern Iraq, the fate of the ancient world was decided. Darius's forces were immense: cavalry from Central Asia, infantry from across the empire, war elephants, chariots. Alexander's army was smaller, but it was unified. And Alexander himself was relentless. The battle unfolded beneath open skies, dust rising as armies collided. Again, Alexander drove toward the center, seeking not slaughter but the king. When Darius fled once more, Persia's imperial order broke. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered. Treasures accumulated over centuries poured into Macedonian hands. And Alexander marched onward toward the ceremonial heart of Persia itself, Persepolis, the city of eternity, the symbol of empire. The storm had arrived, and Persia, old and vast, stood trembling before the footsteps of a young conqueror who believed he was chosen to reshape the world. Beneath the shadow of the Zagros Mountains, Alexander entered the heart of an ancient order, Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the city of stone processions and imperial ritual, the place where kings had once received the tribute of the world. Now its gates open not for delegates, but for conquest. In 330 BCE, Alexander marched into Persepolis as victor. The treasures of the Achaemenids, gold, silver, jewels, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries, were seized. The palaces that had symbolized eternity were reduced to spoils. For Alexander, Persepolis was more than a prize. It was a symbol. To conquer Persia was to conquer the greatest empire the world had known. To take Persepolis was to inherit that empire's prestige. But symbols demand gestures. And here, history turned tragic. What followed remains one of antiquity's most haunting moments, the burning of Persepolis. Ancient sources differ in detail. Some describe a drunken banquet, where Alexander and his companions, inflamed by wine and memory of Persian destruction of Athens, set fire to the palaces. Others suggest it was calculated, an act of revenge, or a deliberate signal that the old order was finished. Whatever the motive, the result was undeniable. Flames climbed cedar beams. Smoke rose into the night sky. The Apadana's columns stood against the fire like silent witnesses. Persepolis, the empire's dream of permanence, burned. It was not only architecture collapsing, it was an era ending. Yet even as Persia's symbols fell, the empire's king still lived. Darius III fled eastward, seeking refuge among loyal satraps. But the empire he commanded was dissolving. Provincial governors, once bound by Persian legitimacy, now calculated survival. Loyalty became fragile. And in the end, Darius was betrayed not by Alexander directly, but by his own men. In 330 BCE, Darius was captured and murdered by Bessus, a satrap who sought to claim the throne for himself. The last king of kings died abandoned on the roadside, far from Persepolis, far from the grandeur of Achaemenid tradition. Alexander found his body and, according to tradition, honored him with burial. It was a gesture both political and symbolic. Alexander was not merely destroying Persia. He was inheriting it. The fall of Darius marked the collapse of Achaemenid rule. 2 centuries of Persian imperial order ended not with a single battle, but with a chain of defeats, betrayals, and symbolic destruction. And yet, Persia did not vanish. This is the deeper truth. Alexander could conquer armies and burn palaces, but he could not erase Persian civilization. Instead, he was drawn into it. He adopted Persian dress. He kept Persian administrators. He married into Persian nobility. He sought to fuse Macedonian and Persian worlds, imagining himself not only as conqueror, but as successor to the King of Kings. Persia's defeat was military, but Persia's influence endured. The empire fell, yet its culture shaped the conqueror. Thus, the storm from the west did not simply destroy Persia. It transformed the ancient world into something new, a Hellenistic age where Greek and Persian legacies intertwined. The old order had ended, but its echoes remained. With the death of Darius III, the Achaemenid Empire, the greatest imperial structure the ancient world had yet built, came to an end. Not with a single moment of collapse, but with a slow unmaking. Armies shattered, provinces surrendered, palaces burned, legitimacy broken. The King of Kings was gone. Persepolis, the symbol of eternity, lay in ashes. And Alexander stood amid the ruins of an ancient order, holding in his hands the inheritance of Asia. Yet conquest is never as simple as victory. To defeat Persia militarily was one thing. To replace Persia as a civilization was another. Alexander soon discovered that the empire he had conquered could not simply be ruled as a Macedonian kingdom. Its scale was too vast, its peoples too diverse, its administrative traditions too deeply rooted. Persia's system endured even after Persia's kings were gone. Satrapies remained the only way to govern such distances. Persian officials, scribes, and bureaucrats continued their work. Roads still connected provinces. Tribute still flowed. The machinery of empire could not be dismantled overnight. And Alexander, the conqueror, began to change. He adopted elements of Persian kingship. He wore Persian garments. He demanded rituals of court that shocked his Macedonian companions. He married Roxana of Bactria. Then later took Persian royal wives, seeking legitimacy not only through force, but through dynastic fusion. In this, Alexander revealed a profound truth. Persia had fallen, but Persia was not erased. Its culture, prestige, and imperial logic shaped the conqueror as much as he reshaped it. The Hellenistic world that followed was born from this collision, a fusion of Greek and Persian legacies stretching from Egypt to Central Asia. Cities founded by Alexander carried Greek language and architecture, yet they stood upon Persian roads and within Persian administrative landscapes. The old empire was gone, but its imprint remained everywhere. Alexander himself did not live long enough to consolidate his vision. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, only 32 years old, leaving no clear successor capable of holding his vast conquests together. And as his generals carved his empire into rival kingdoms, Persia's lands became battlegrounds once more. The Achaemenid age had ended. But Persia's story did not end, because civilizations endure beyond the fall of dynasties. The memory of Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, the empire of roads, fire, and order, remained embedded in the identity of the Iranian world. In time, new Persian powers would rise again, the Parthians, the Sasanians, reviving Iranian kingship and challenging Rome itself. Alexander's storm had shattered the old order, and it had not extinguished the Persian spirit. The fall of Persia was symbolic, the end of one of history's greatest imperial experiments. Yet its legacy lived on, in governance, in religion, in culture, in the very concept of empire. Thus, from the ashes of Persepolis, history moved forward into a new age. An age where Persia was conquered, yet still present. Where Greek and Iranian worlds intertwined. Where the ancient empire became memory, but memory became foundation for rebirth. And in the next chapter, we will see Persia rise again, not as the Achaemenids, but as a new power forged from survival. For though Alexander ended an empire, Persia itself endured, and from the ruins of conquest, a reborn Iran would one day challenge the world once more. Chapter 10. Persia, Reborn. Under the Parthians. In the aftermath of Alexander's storm, the ancient world entered an age of fragments. The Achaemenid Empire, the vast order of Cyrus and Darius, was gone. Persepolis lay in ruin. The King of Kings was no more, and across the lands of Persia, Greek-speaking rulers now claimed authority, heirs not of Iranian tradition, but of Macedonian conquest. Yet Persia was not erased, because civilizations do not vanish when dynasties fall. They endure in language, memory, ritual, and identity, quiet forces stronger than armies. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire shattered almost immediately. His generals, the Diadochi, fought bitter wars over the spoils. Out of these struggles emerged the Seleucid Empire, which claimed much of Persia and the Near East. For a time, Greek influence spread deep into Iranian lands. New cities were founded with Hellenistic architecture. Greek became the language of administration and elite culture. Coins bore the faces of Macedonian kings. To many observers, it may have seemed that Persia had been absorbed into a new world. But beneath the surface, Iran was waiting. The Seleucid Empire was vast, overstretched, and foreign in the eyes of many local peoples. Its rulers governed from distant capitals, struggling to control provinces that had once belonged to Persia's own imperial system. And in the east, beyond the settled heartlands, new forces were gathering. From the steppe frontiers of Central Asia came the Parni, an Iranian nomadic people skilled in cavalry warfare, hardened by open horizons and constant motion. They lived far from the marble courts of Seleucid kings, beyond the reach of Hellenistic certainty. In the mid-3 RD century BCE, under a leader named Arsaces, the Parni struck. They seized Parthia, a region south of the Caspian Sea, and declared independence from Seleucid rule. It was a small rebellion at first, a frontier uprising. But history has often begun with such sparks. Arsaces founded a dynasty that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. The Arsacid kings, the Parthians. At first, their power was fragile. The Seleucids attempted to reclaim the lost province, launching campaigns eastward, but the Seleucid grip was weakening, pulled apart by wars in the west and internal instability. And the Parthians endured. Their strength lay not in vast infantry armies or monumental cities, but in mobility. Horse archers, cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry that struck like steel thunder. Parthian warfare was shaped by the steppe, swift, elusive, devastating. They could retreat and return, harass and encircle, fight not by holding ground, but by mastering movement. Slowly, Parthian power expanded. They pushed westward into Iran, reclaiming lands that had once been Persian. They took Media. They seized Mesopotamia. They entered Babylon not as Greeks, but as Iranian kings. The ancient heartlands of empire were returning to Iranian rule. This was not the rebirth of the Achaemenids. It was something new. The Parthian Empire was different in structure, more decentralized, built on noble families and regional autonomy rather than rigid imperial bureaucracy. Yet it carried the deep continuity of Iranian identity. Persia was re-emerging, not as a memory, but as a living force. And with Parthia's rise, a new great rivalry appeared on the horizon. To the west, another empire was ascending, Rome. The Mediterranean world was consolidating under Roman power, expanding eastward with the same relentless logic that Persia once carried westward. Soon, the Parthians would face Rome across the Euphrates in one of antiquity's longest and most dramatic imperial struggles. Persia, conquered by Alexander, was now reborn as Parthia. The story was not finished. It was evolving. The Iranian world had survived conquest, absorbed influence, endured foreign rule, and returned. Thus began a new chapter of resilience. An empire of horsemen and kings, standing between east and west, refusing to disappear. Beneath the wide skies of Iran, the Parthian Empire grew not as a sudden restoration, but as a gradual reclaiming. The Seleucids, heirs of Alexander's conquest, still ruled vast territories, but their authority was stretched thin. Their empire was centered far to the west, drawn constantly into Mediterranean conflicts. In the east, distance weakened control. Local cultures endured. Iranian nobles remembered older traditions. And the Parthians understood this perfectly. They expanded like a rising tide, patient, opportunistic, relentless. By the 2nd century BCE, under kings such as Mithridates I, Parthia transformed from a regional power into a true empire. Mithridates seized Media, entered Mesopotamia, and captured Seleucid strongholds that had once seemed untouchable. Babylon, the ancient city of empires, passed once more into Iranian hands. This was symbolic beyond measure. For Babylon had been conquered by Cyrus, ruled by Darius, taken by Alexander, governed by Greeks. And now, centuries later, it belonged again to an Iranian dynasty. Persia's soil was reclaiming itself. Yet Parthia was not simply Persia reborn. It was a new imperial form. The Parthians ruled through a balance of power between the Arsacid king and the great noble houses. Regional lords held autonomy, commanding their own forces. The empire was less centralized than the Achaemenids, more feudal in character. This decentralization was both strength and vulnerability. It allowed flexibility, but it also meant internal rivalry could simmer beneath the surface. Still, Parthia endured because its military power was formidable. Parthian cavalry became legendary. Horse archers could strike at range, retreat, and strike again, exhausting enemies unused to steppe warfare. The Parthian shot, firing arrows backward while riding away, became a symbol of their deadly skill. And their armored cataphracts, riders encased in iron, could smash through infantry lines with terrifying force. This was not the warfare of Greek phalanxes or Roman legions. This was the warfare of the open horizon, and it was perfectly suited to the empire's geography. Soon, Parthia's rise brought it face to face with Rome. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world and now looked eastward, toward Syria and beyond. The Euphrates became the frontier between two superpowers, and neither could ignore the other. The first great collision came in 53 BCE, when the Roman general Crassus marched into Parthian territory seeking glory. He expected an easy victory over what Romans dismissed as Eastern horsemen. Instead, at Carrhae, the Parthians annihilated him. Roman legions were surrounded, harassed by endless arrows, crushed by cavalry charges. Crassus was killed, and Rome suffered one of its most humiliating defeats. Carrhae became legendary. It proved that Parthia was not a minor kingdom. It was Rome's equal. For centuries, the Parthians would resist Rome's expansion, fighting wars that reshaped the Near East. Armenia became a contested buffer. Mesopotamia changed hands repeatedly. Neither empire could destroy the other. And through this struggle, Iranian identity deepened. Parthian kings adopted Persian traditions, revived elements of Zoroastrian culture, and presented themselves as heirs to the ancient Iranian world. Even under Hellenistic influence, Persia's spirit endured. The Parthians proved that conquest could not erase civilization. Empires fall, but cultures survive. And in Parthia, Iran rose again. Different, adaptive, resilient, standing as a bridge between worlds, refusing to vanish beneath foreign domination. The rise of the Parthians was one of history's great acts of resilience. Persia had been conquered, its palaces burned, its kings dethroned. For a time it seemed that the Iranian world would dissolve into the Hellenistic age, absorbed beneath Greek language, Macedonian power, and foreign dynasties. But history does not erase civilization so easily. The Parthians proved that identity can survive conquest, that cultures endure beneath occupation, that the soil of Iran remembers its own inheritance. From the steppe frontiers, Arsaces and his successors carved out a kingdom that grew into an empire. They reclaimed Iranian lands, entered Babylon, revived Eastern kingship, and stood as a new guardian of Persia's ancient heart. Their empire was not the centralized machine of Darius. It was looser, more aristocratic, balanced between king and noble houses. Yet it endured for nearly 5 centuries, an extraordinary span, forged not through monuments of stone but through adaptability and cavalry strength. And in their confrontation with Rome, the Parthians became one of antiquity's defining powers. Carrhae shattered Roman arrogance. The Euphrates became a frontier of giants. Neither Rome nor Parthia could fully dominate the other, and the Near East became a contested world where Iranian and Mediterranean civilizations collided again and again. Yet Parthia's greatest achievement was not only military, it was cultural survival. Under Parthian rule, Iranian traditions resurfaced, Zoroastrian elements endured, Persian identity deepened. The memory of the Achaemenids remained alive, not as nostalgia, but as foundation. Persia's story was not finished. It was evolving. The Parthians were proof that conquest is never absolute. Alexander had shattered an empire, but he had not extinguished a civilization. The Iranian world adapted, absorbed, resisted, and returned. And yet, Parthia itself carried seeds of fragility. Its decentralization, its noble rivalries, its internal tensions would grow over time. Rome remained an eternal pressure at the western frontier. The Arsacid kings, powerful as they were, could not always control the ambitions of their own aristocracy. By the 3rd century CE, Parthia began to weaken. And from within Iran, another force was rising, one that would revive Persian kingship with new intensity, new centralization, and new glory. The Sasanians. Thus, Persia's rebirth under the Parthians was not an ending, but a bridge. From the ashes of Alexander to the dawn of a new Iranian Renaissance. For the empire of horsemen would one day give way to an empire of fire and stone once more. And in the next chapter, Persia rises again in its last great pre-Islamic golden age, as the Sasanian Empire emerges to challenge Rome and restore Iran's imperial destiny. Chapter 11. The Glory of the Sasanian Age. In the long arc of Persian history, there are moments when the past seems to return, not as memory, but as rebirth. After centuries of Parthian rule, Iran still stood as a great power. Yet its empire had grown loose, decentralized, stretched between noble rivalries and the constant pressure of Rome. The Arsacid kings endured, but their authority weakened. Provincial lords grew bold, the imperial structure frayed. And then, from within Persia itself, a new dynasty rose, one that would not merely replace Parthia, but revive the ancient idea of Persia with renewed intensity. The Sasanians. In the early 3rd century CE, in the province of Persis, the homeland of the old Achaemenids, a local ruler named Ardashir challenged Parthian authority. He was not a foreign conqueror. He was Iranian soil rising against Iranian decline. In 224 CE, Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, at the Battle of Hormozgan. The Arsacid age ended, and a new Persian Empire was born. The Sasanian Empire was not simply another dynasty. It was a renaissance, a deliberate revival of Persian kingship, centralization, and cultural identity. Where the Parthians ruled through noble balance, the Sasanians ruled through imperial structure. They sought to restore the glory of Iran as a unified world power. Ardashir called himself Shahanshah, King of Kings, a title echoing directly from the Achaemenid past. But this was not nostalgia. It was ambition. The Sasanians believed they were the rightful heirs of Cyrus and Darius, guardians of an ancient Iranian destiny interrupted by Alexander and centuries of foreign influence. And at the heart of this revival burned the sacred flame once more. Zoroastrianism, long present but varied under Parthian rule, was now elevated with renewed authority. The Sasanian kings intertwined religion and monarchy tightly, presenting themselves as defenders of the true faith, protectors of cosmic order. Fire temples flourished. Priestly institutions strengthened. The empire became not only political, but deeply ideological, a moral universe of Iranian identity standing against the outside world. And the outside world was immense. To the west stood Rome, now transformed into the Byzantine Empire, a Christian superpower ruling the Mediterranean. Thus began one of the greatest rivalries in history: Rome and Persia. Two empires, two worlds locked in centuries of struggle. The Sasanians were not content to merely survive beside Rome. They challenged it. Shapur I, Ardashir's son, became one of Persia's most formidable rulers. In the mid-3 RD century, he launched campaigns deep into Roman territory. Cities fell, armies clashed. And in 260 CE, Shapur achieved the unimaginable. He captured a Roman emperor alive. Valerian, ruler of Rome, was taken prisoner, an event unparalleled in Roman history. Persian reliefs carved this triumph into stone, showing the Shahanshah towering above the defeated emperor. It was a declaration. Persia had returned, not as a frontier power, but as Rome's equal. Yet the Sasanian age was not only war, it was civilization. Grand cities rose. Ctesiphon, with its immense arch of the Takhkasra, became the imperial capital, a symbol of architectural ambition. Persian art flourished in silverwork, textiles, and intricate reliefs. Science, medicine, and philosophy found patronage. Persia became a bridge of knowledge between India, Greece, and the wider world. This was a golden twilight, the last great pre-Islamic renaissance of Iran. An empire of fire and stone, faith and ambition, standing as the final guardian of the old Iranian world before the next transformation arrived. Beneath the vaulted halls of Ctesiphon, the Sasanian Empire reached a sophistication that echoed the ancient grandeur of Persia while forging something uniquely its own. The Sasanians were builders not only of armies, but of identity. They centralized power, strengthened bureaucracy, and revived the ceremonial majesty of kingship. The Shahanshah was not merely a ruler, he was the axis of the world, crowned in splendor, bound to divine authority, standing as guardian of Iran against the forces of chaos beyond its borders. And beyond those borders stood Rome. For 4 centuries, the Roman-Persian rivalry became one of history's defining struggles. Two superpowers locked across Mesopotamia, Armenia, Syria, and the Caucasus. The frontier was never still. Cities changed hands. Armies marched again and again through the same contested plains. Yet this conflict was not only military, it was civilizational. Rome was now Christian, imagining itself as the universal empire of a new faith. Persia was Zoroastrian, imagining itself as the guardian of ancient cosmic order. Two visions of world destiny confronted one another. Under kings like Shapur I, Persia struck deep into Roman lands. Under later rulers, Rome struck back. The wars were exhausting, but they also forged Persian strength. The Sasanians developed disciplined cavalry forces, armored cataphracts, and complex siege warfare. Persia was no longer the steppe flexibility of Parthia. It was imperial professionalism. But the glory of the Sasanian age was not confined to battlefields. It was cultural renaissance. Ctesiphon, the capital, became one of the greatest cities of late antiquity. Its monumental arch, the Takhkasra, still stands in ruin today, a reminder of Persian architectural ambition. Palaces glittered with mosaics and silver. Court rituals rivaled Byzantium in complexity. Persian art flourished, delicate metalwork, royal hunting scenes, intricate textiles that would later influence Islamic and even European design. Persia became a center of learning. The Academy of Gundeshapur emerged as a renowned institution of medicine and scholarship, drawing knowledge from Greek, Indian, and Iranian traditions. In this era, Persia was a bridge of civilizations. Ideas moved along its roads as much as armies did. Zoroastrian authority also deepened. Priests gained influence, religious texts were compiled, and the sacred fire became even more central to imperial identity. The empire's ideology presented Iran as a land of truth, standing against external disorder. Yet such ideological strength carried tension. Religious minorities, Christians, Jews, others, lived within Persia, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, depending on the politics of war with Byzantium. The empire's moral universe was powerful, but also rigid. Still, the Sasanian age produced some of Persia's greatest rulers. None shone brighter than Khosrow I Anushirvan in the 6th century, remembered as a just king, a patron of philosophy, a reformer of administration. Under Khosrow, Persia reached a zenith of governance and cultural brilliance. And under his grandson, Khosrow II, Persia would achieve its greatest territorial expansion, capturing Jerusalem, Egypt, and pushing Byzantium to the brink. For a moment it seemed Persia might finally eclipse Rome itself. The old Iranian dream of universal empire burned brightly again. But history's golden twilights carry an undertone of fragility. The more magnificent the empire becomes, the closer it may be to exhaustion. For the long war with Byzantium drained both superpowers. And beyond the southern deserts, a new force was gathering, unnoticed, underestimated, destined to transform the world. The Sasanian Empire stood as Persia's last great pre-Islamic dawn of glory. It was a renaissance of kingship and culture, a revival of ancient Iranian identity forged into new imperial strength. From Ardashir's rebellion against Parthian decline to Shapur's triumph over Rome, Persia had returned to the center of world history. For 4 centuries, the Sasanians ruled as Rome's greatest rival, an empire of fire temples and grand capitals, of armored cavalry and philosophical courts, of sacred legitimacy and artistic brilliance. Ctesiphon rose as a jewel of late antiquity. The Takht Khasra's arch proclaimed imperial ambition. Gundeshapur gathered knowledge from across civilizations. Zoroastrian authority deepened, binding faith and kingship into one moral order. Persia was not merely surviving, it was flourishing. And yet, the Sasanian age was also a golden twilight. Because even at its height, exhaustion was gathering beneath the surface. The endless wars with Byzantium drained both empires. Generations of conflict consumed wealth, manpower, and stability. Victories were immense, but they were costly. When Khosrow II pushed Persia to its greatest territorial reach, holding Egypt, Syria, Jerusalem, the triumph was dazzling. But unsustainable. Byzantium, battered to the edge, struck back under Heraclius. Persian armies faltered. The long war ended not with Persia's domination, but with mutual ruin. The empire returned to its borders weakened, and weakness invites upheaval. Within Persia, court rivalries erupted. Kings rose and fell in rapid succession. Noble factions competed. The centralized strength that had defined the Sasanian revival began to fracture under internal instability. The sacred flame still burned. The palaces still stood. But the empire was tired. And beyond Persia's southern horizon, history was preparing its next transformation. In Arabia, a new religious and political force was emerging, unified, energized, carrying a message that would soon sweep across the Near East. The Sasanians, guardians of the old Iranian world, did not yet see the scale of what was coming. Empires often fail not because they are powerless, but because they are exhausted when the new age arrives. Thus, the Sasanian Empire stands as Persia's last great pre-Islamic glory, magnificent, sophisticated, deeply rooted in ancient identity. It was the final guardian of the old order, and it was destined to face the most profound transformation in Persian history. For in the next chapter, the Arab Islamic conquests will break the Sasanian state, and Persia will enter a new era, no longer as the empire of fire temples and shahanshahs, but as a civilization transforming within the Islamic world. And so, as the last great Persian kings fade into twilight, a new dawn rises beyond the desert, one that will reshape Iran and the world forever. Chapter 12. The Dawn of a New Persia. In the 7th century of the Common Era, the ancient world stood at the edge of transformation. For 400 years, the Sasanian Empire had carried the last great flame of pre-Islamic Persia, an empire of fire temples, shahanshahs, and imperial rivalry with Rome. It was the final guardian of an old Iranian order stretching back to Cyrus and Darius. Yet even the strongest empires cannot escape exhaustion. By the early 600s, Persia was drained. The long, catastrophic war with Byzantium had consumed generations. Armies were depleted. Kizni were emptied. Provinces were restless. Court intrigue fractured the throne. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed. The sacred aura of monarchy weakened. And the empire, though still vast in memory, was fragile in reality. It was in this moment of fatigue that a new force emerged from the southern deserts, unexpected, unified, and carrying a message that would reshape history. Arabia, long seen by empires as peripheral, had become the birthplace of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad had united tribes beneath a new faith and political vision. After his death in 632, the Rashidun caliphs carried Islam beyond Arabia with astonishing speed. What followed was not merely conquest, it was a civilizational shift. The armies that moved northward were not the massive imperial hosts of Persia or Byzantium. They were smaller, mobile, driven by belief, discipline, and momentum. Persia, exhausted and divided, was unprepared. In 633, the first clashes began along the frontiers of Mesopotamia. At first, these raids may have seemed like manageable disturbances, another frontier threat. But history was already turning. In 636, the Byzantine Empire suffered a devastating defeat at Yarmouk. The Roman East faltered, and Persia faced its own reckoning. The decisive confrontation came at al-Qadisiyah around 636–637. Persian forces, still formidable in cavalry and tradition, met the Arab armies near the Euphrates. The battle was brutal. War elephants, symbols of Sasanian might, charged across the field. Persian nobles fought with the pride of an ancient order, yet exhaustion, internal weakness, and the relentless cohesion of the Arab forces tipped the balance. Persia was defeated. Ctesiphon, the imperial capital, fell soon after. The Arch of Takhkasra, once the symbol of Persian majesty, looked out over a world changing beyond recognition. The King of Kings, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward, seeking refuge, gathering resistance, but the empire was dissolving around him. One by one, provinces fell. In 642, at the Battle of Nahavand, remembered as the victory of victories by the Arabs, the last major Sasanian army was shattered. The old Persian imperial order ended. By 651, Yazdegerd III was dead. The Sasanian dynasty vanished into history, and with it ended the last pre-Islamic Persian Empire. It was a moment of immense rupture. Fire temples dimmed. Royal courts disappeared. The Shahanshah was no more. The empire that had stood for centuries had fallen in less than a generation. Yet here lies the deeper truth of Persia. Persia did not vanish, because Persia was never only an empire. It was a civilization. And civilizations endure in ways armies cannot destroy. The conquest ended a dynasty, but it opened a transformation. Beneath the collapse of the Sasanian throne, the world might have believed that Persia was finished. The king of kings was gone. Ctesiphon had fallen. The fire temples that had burned for centuries now stood uncertain beneath a new political and religious order. To many, it must have seemed like the end of an ancient civilization. But Persia's story has always been one of endurance through transformation. Empires fall. Civilizations adapt. The Arab Islamic conquests did not erase Iran. They absorbed it into a new and expanding world, one shaped by Islam, Arabic language, and the Caliphate's growing authority. At first, Persia became a province of the new empire. Administrators were replaced. Tribute was redirected. The old aristocracy weakened, though many local elites survived by adapting to new realities. The early Islamic rulers inherited not an empty land, but one of the most sophisticated societies on earth. Persia had centuries of bureaucracy, taxation, urban culture, and intellectual tradition. The Caliphate, expanding rapidly, needed systems to govern its new territories. And Persia provided them. Persian administrators, scribes, and scholars became essential to the functioning of the Islamic State. The empire that conquered Persia soon found itself shaped by Persia's legacy. This was the paradox of conquest. The conqueror takes the land, but the conquered reshapes the civilization. Over time, Islam spread across Iran. Many Persians converted, not always immediately, but gradually across generations. Yet conversion did not mean cultural disappearance. Persian identity endured beneath the new faith, blending into Islamic civilization rather than dissolving within it. The Persian language, though challenged by Arabic dominance, survived. It re-emerged in new forms, enriched by Arabic vocabulary, but rooted in Iranian soul. Persian poetry, literature, and storytelling would soon become among the most luminous achievements of the Islamic world. And Persian thought shaped Islamic philosophy, governance, and science. The Abbasid Caliphate, which rose in 750 CE, was deeply influenced by Persian support. Its capital, Baghdad, though Arab in name, was built near the heartlands of old Mesopotamia and Persia's administrative world. The Abbasid court adopted Persian customs, ceremonial traditions, and bureaucratic practices. Persia was no longer ruling as an empire, but it was shaping the empire from within. In the centuries that followed, Persian scholars became giants of the Islamic Golden Age. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy all flourished through minds formed in Iranian lands. Persia's spirit moved into new worlds of knowledge. And culturally, Iran became a bridge, preserving ancient traditions while contributing to a new civilization that stretched from Spain to India. This is why Persia's fall was not an ending. It was a transformation. The Sasanian Empire ended, but Iran's cultural brilliance endured, flowing into Islam like a river entering a greater sea, still itself, yet part of something larger. The empire became memory, but the civilization remained alive. And in time, Persian dynasties would rise again under Islam, local rulers reclaiming Iranian identity within the broader caliphate, proving once more that Persia could not be extinguished. The ancient story of Persia was closing. But a new Persia was being born. In the end, the fall of the Sasanian Empire was not the death of Persia. It was the end of one form, and the beginning of another. The Arab-Islamic conquests shattered the last great pre-Islamic Persian state. The Shahanshahs vanished, fire temples dimmed. The old imperial order, stretching back through Parthians and Achaemenids, became history. But Persia was never only its kings. Persia was language, memory, art, ideas, and those cannot be burned like palaces. In the centuries after conquest, Iran transformed within Islamic civilization, becoming one of its greatest intellectual and cultural engines. Persian administrators shaped the caliphate's bureaucracy. Persian scholars illuminated medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Persian poets gave voice to spiritual depth and human longing in words that would echo for a millennium. The conquerors had taken Persia's empire, but Persia had given the new world its soul. This is the profound truth that closes the ancient story. Empires end. Civilizations endure. The Achaemenids built roads across continents. The Sasanians guarded the last flame of the old Iranian world. And after them, Persia entered Islam not as a vanished land, but as a transforming civilization, flowing into a new age, influencing the very shape of the medieval world. Persia became a bridge between antiquity and the future. Its spirit survived in culture, in scholarship, in identity, and in the endless continuity of Iranian civilization. The empire became memory, but the memory became immortality. And so, the entire history of the Persian Empire does not end in ashes. It ends in endurance. For Persia's greatest legacy was never only the land it ruled, but the ideas it carried forward through time. And as the ancient empires fade into the horizon, Persia remains, reborn again and again, an eternal civilization beneath the echoes of history. And so, beneath the ruins of Persepolis and the echoes of ancient kings, the Persian Empire lives on, unfinished, eternal, waiting to be told in full.